big week in politics with President Cyril Ramaphosa's State of the Nation address coming on Thursday.
We know the economy is gloomy, unemployment at its peak. What can we expect the president to say that will give hope to South Africans?
I think we've heard way too many speeches that have been about inspiration and have been about, feel-good sensibilities, and I don't think that that's what the country needs right now.
It's almost like the school of thought has remained the same. The ANC says that we are pro-poor, pro-black, but does that really translate into the transformation that we want to see?
Well, that's always the problem, and that's what it comes down to, is implementation. You can make any announcement you like at SONA, it comes down to the implementation. I think that's where the last two SONAs have fallen short.
It needs a president who's going to say, here are the top 5 practical steps that will be taken. Anything short of that is just going to be missed by the people of South Africa. We need a country that can say, these are the mandates of this president, and this is what we can hold him accountable.
Good evening and welcome to the DA's coverage of the 2021 State of the Nation address, coming to you live from Cape Town. My name is Richard Newton and I'll be your host for this evening. Joining me in studio are the DA Deputy Federal Council Chairperson, Asha Sarupan, and the Shadow Minister for the Presidency, Solly Malatsi. Welcome to you both.
It's a pleasure.
During the course of this evening, we will be hearing from the DA Federal Leader, John Steenhuisen, and the DA Parliamentary Leadership from the National Assembly. And in an action-packed program, we will also get views and reviews from a host of DA Shadow Ministers who will be joining us via Zoom. To get the ball rolling, I'd like to bring my studio guests into play and ask each of you what you believe the number one priority issue is that the President must get right in the State of the Nation address. Can we start with you, Asha?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing that he needs to announce, and it's absolutely crucial, is vaccines. So far, he's spoken in broad, sweeping terms with unspecified deadlines about vaccines. The reality is that we need to vaccinate about 100,000 people a day to reach what he terms population immunity. And until we can actually order the vaccine, secure the supply, make sure that they're not about to expire and that they're effective in the South African variant, we're not going to reach that, and it's going to result in a second wave and a third wave and a fourth wave and more lockdowns, and that's going to be devastating on the livelihoods of millions of South Africans who have already suffered for almost a year now with lockdowns, waiting for some sort of solution to this crisis.
Solly, from your side?
Yeah, look, I think for me, the priority is going to be the president's got to show in unequivocal terms how he's going to deal with corruption in government. And it links to the point that Asho makes, because we know that every single political development and transaction in our country has been infested by corruption. Even, the procurement of PPE, for instance. And the best way for him to start is within cabinet. That is where the leading figures in the ANC and in government have been hidden and continue to perpetrate corruption. Because in the previous SONAs, he has said the right things, but he hasn't done the right things to correspond with his words when it comes to corruption. Because I think this is the moment where South Africans need to see that there's consequences for people who steal public money, and that there's consequences for politicians who continue to steal money from the public purse.
Very true, and I think tonight's SONA will be one without pomp and ceremony. It'll be without bells and whistles, and probably without the threat of disruptions for the sake of disruptions. But given the ANC government's track record, it'll also be without probably concrete plans or any deliverable promises. Another break from tradition which we'll have tonight is the pre-SONA input from the leader of the opposition, the traditional pre-SONA alternative SONA. This year, DA Federal Leader John Steenhuisen has given what he termed a true State of the Nation address. And let's take a look at some of the highlights of this address, after which we'll chat about the points he's making.
Sure.
In the past, we've referred to this address as the Alternative State of the Nation, or ASONA. But I feel this name does not accurately describe the difference between this summation of where we stand as a nation and the one you will no doubt hear from President Ramaphosa in a few days' time. This here is a truthful assessment of what went wrong, where we now stand, what our realistic prospects for the future are, and what we can do to improve this outlook. It's not a sugar-coated version. It's not vague rhetoric or spin to conceal the harsh truth. No lies to cover up wrongdoing. Just the facts. Which is why we're calling this address the true state of the nation. Because now, more than ever, we need an honest assessment of the state of our nation. And you will certainly not get this from the President on the 11th of February. He will underplay our economic crisis. He will overplay government's COVID response. And he will continue to outright lie about our vaccine plan. The hard truth is that we are a nation in crisis on 3 fronts. Firstly, we're in a COVID crisis, from which the only way out is the immediate rollout of a massive vaccination program. Secondly, we're in an economic crisis, and here the only way out is a raft of urgent, bold and brave economic reforms. And thirdly, we're in a crisis of democracy, as the recent shocking testimony at the Zondo Commission has revealed. And the only immediate way out of this crisis, if we're brutally honest, is for our government to resign in shame. However, we can say with near certainty that none of these 3 things is going to happen right away. While we're still waiting for a full detailed vaccination plan from the President, we do know that we won't have nearly enough vaccines in time to prevent a 3rd and possibly a 4th wave of the virus from running through our country. This leaves the prospect of further lockdowns looming over our already shattered economy. That will most certainly bring on a sovereign debt crisis, along with another wave of job losses and extraordinary human suffering and deprivation.
Well, that is certainly a very sobering depiction of the real state of our nation. But tonight we will be hearing from a host of DA shadow ministers who will bring us a raft of possible solutions and ways that we can get the country back on track. Asho, from what John said, he touched on what you were saying about the vaccines. We have to move away from empty promises.
Yeah, well, we've got to get to concrete plans, and quickly. We've got to get some deliverables as to what are we going to do when these vaccines arrive to roll them out. Every single provincial health department actually needs to have a plan. I know the Western Cape provincial government has a detailed plan in place. We haven't seen much from the other provinces. So those sorts of things need to happen. But we also need to see larger plans, big, meaningful, impactful plans around jobs and the economy. We've had a jobs bloodbath as a consequence of some very harsh lockdowns and some very irrational regulations around those lockdowns. And what the country desperately needs now is a major course of fiscal correction that will make sure that we begin to spend what little government money we have left, taxpayer money we have left, on things that make an impact on growing the economy, on saving jobs and creating new jobs, and actually getting the country back on track. And if we don't get hard choices out of the SONA tonight, we're in for another year of quite frankly, very difficult times.
Can we do this? I mean, if you talk about the various challenges, it's just one after the other after the other. Is there any chance that we can really see something coming out tonight that will address all of these, Solly?
Well, it all starts with courageous leadership, which is something that is lacking in abundance in the president, and that is why you won't see any of that. Because even if you look with the size of the government as is, you look anywhere else in the economy, businesses have taken a cut, families have taken a cut in their incomes. We still have this size of a bloated cabinet, which results in a very bloated civil service that we have. That is one area where the president can act in solidarity with what everybody else in the country has been feeling by downsizing the size of cabinet so that it is much more efficient. But it also goes beyond that. I mean, the president has had ample opportunity to speak to the nation about his plans. This is an opportunity to showcase what will be done. And speaking to the point I made earlier about corruption, those special unit investigations that are taking place now, it's ultimately up to the president to sign proclamations once the investigations are concluded so that we can start seeing those real consequences. And unless there is that consistency, it's going to be very difficult to have anything credible coming out of this State of the Nation address, which hasn't been heard before. Because what we have noticed and what the president has done as part of his PR machinery is to pander to what society expects to hear in terms of corruption, job creation. But the evidence is always different. You look at the rising number of unemployment now in the country, it goes against all these promises of the number of 1 million jobs that will be created by the state. And it's because when you start paying attention to what's being said in each and every SONA and compared to what's actually happening, the gap is far too huge.
And I think we do have some fact sheets we got from our researchers, which we can look at a little later, about what over the last 10 years has been promised and what has actually been delivered. And it makes for some rather scary reading. But for the moment, we're now going to cross live to our team who are based this evening at Parliament. And to give us an idea of what we can expect from this toned down SONA, we speak to the Chief Whip of the official opposition in Parliament, our very own Natasha Mazzoni.
I think, as you can see, the setting for SONA tonight completely different to anything we've seen before. 50 members in total inside the House, a very demure atmosphere, as it should be. We're a country in mourning. 12 members of Parliament have died of the COVID pandemic, friends and family. So I think tonight we can expect a very downplayed SONA. I think we can expect a lot of explaining by the President, trying to explain away massive failures that have happened. For example, the vaccine rollout failures, the TERS and UIF failures that we've seen, the failure to roll out healthcare across our country, the increase in crime over the COVID period. I think these are the kind of things that the President's going to talk about. So certainly not a jovial SONA.
The DA set up cabinet put together a document with proposals of how we can get South Africa back from the brink. Give us some highlights.
So what we've done is we've put together a document called the Blue Book. We've handed it to the President, and it's what we would do if we were the Cabinet in government at the moment. And I think it's so important to note that the DA, if we find a problem, we find a solution for it too. So we've looked at ways of boosting the economy to make sure that small and medium enterprises have a lot less red tape to deal with when they open up, to ensure that UIF and TERS benefits are paid on time. We're looking at social grant benefits and the way those can be paid out in a more effective manner. We're looking at how we can open the energy sector to ensure that energy can be procured from cities that can afford to do it, so that, like today, where we have load shedding on stage 3, many places like Stellenbosch municipality, for example, wouldn't have to have any load shedding whatsoever. So we have practical solutions to the many problems that face South Africa, and we've given the ANC our book and offered them our solutions.
Now, the DA lobbying government for a free virtual SONA. How much is this hybrid SONA costing South Africa?
Well, at this stage, the costs are still unknown. We're looking at about a couple of R100,000. One must remember that what you don't see is behind the scenes, all the staff that are here, the amount of security. Though there might be only 50 members of Parliament here, but there was still a full security detail. We wanted a fully virtual Parliament. Main reason was every single cent this country has, we think should be being spent on vaccines. So we don't know yet, but we'll certainly be interrogating every cent that has been spent tonight.
Thank you very much for that perspective from Parliament, Natasha. As we said, not the SONA South Africans, either at home or the MPs themselves, are used to. As MPs, do you believe that not having everyone there detracts from the event? Do you think everyone should be in the House, or can we do it just as well virtually?
Well, I'm not sure that South African public always appreciates a red carpet and seeing MPs dressed at their finest and so on. I do think that the state has eroded so much trust between itself and its citizens that it just looks like another event for politicians to show off. Certainly, if we were sober-minded about the state was sober-minded about this, they would have, as Natasha said, taken every cent that they had and channeled it towards the vaccine, towards immediate relief to households, to anything that is productive that can help people get through a very difficult time with these lockdowns and with COVID and the regulations, beef up the healthcare system so that the next time we do have a peak, if we have another peak, that there are enough hospital beds. All of that would be far more productive spending than having a full security detail at Parliament. So I don't think it was essential at all to have any member of Parliament in the House tonight with the full presidential security detail and no doubt a lot of private security and bomb squads and so on. I mean, if we were to attend a normal sitting as members of Parliament, there isn't a bomb squad. Yeah. So we don't get searched 1,000 times to make sure that any of these things are there. But it's always set up for SONA. It's a massive expense. And quite frankly, it gives the public no value.
And talking of no value, I mean, what Natasha was saying there, Solly, was we can expect probably a lot of excuses why things couldn't be done and why promises haven't been fulfilled. At some point, there has to be a tipping point where people say, I just can't do excuses anymore. We need to see results.
No, definitely, because, I mean, you can almost anticipate that a large portion of what the president would say, if not everything, he would have said throughout the addresses that he has had to the nation in dealing with this pandemic. And I think it's a very key development that today the focus isn't on the pre-activities leading to the speech, such as the red carpet. It will be on what is in the content of the President's State of the Nation address, which is what it should always be about. And if you take away the glitz and the glamour of that, and you take away the pros from what the President would say, we're going to be able to measure very accurately whether what is being said is actually deliverable. And this will be probably the first time where a lot of South Africans will be able to pay attention to the substance of the President's promises and be able to strip away the empty rhetoric surrounding some of them. So I'm looking forward to that because it is important to showcase the legacy of broken promises that President Ramaphosa has continued since coming to office.
Well, definitely, I'm sure we'll see a lot more of that. But we are now joined by on Zoom by Leon Schreiber, the DA Shadow Minister of Public Service and Administration. Goeienaand Leon, en baie dankie dat jy by ons aangesluit het. My eerste vraag gaan oor kaderontplooiing. Wat is kaderontplooiing en hoe impakteer dit die regering se dagtaak?
Naand Richard en naand aan al die kykers. Ja, kaderontplooiing is niks minder as 'n sistematiese poging en beleid van die ANC om die grondwetlike skeiding wat daar moet bestaan tussen die staat en party te ondermyn nie. Wat dit in feite beteken is dat 'n klein komitee van ANC-leiers, waarvan president Cyril Ramaphosa onder president Jacob Zuma die voorsitter was, bymekaar kom in rookgevulde vertrekke iewers in Letoile-huis en besluit wie aangestel moet word by sleutelposte in die staatsdiens. Die effek hiervan wat ons nou al gesien het vir dekades lank, is dat onbekwame mense aangestel word omdat lojaliteit aan die ANC gesien word as die heel belangrikste kriterium. En dit beteken natuurlik dat ons nie die beste vaardighede kry nie, want ons kyk net na mense wat lojaal is aan die ANC en hulle kry hierdie poste in die staatsdiens en die effek daarvan is staatskaping en korrupsie op 'n ongekende skaal.
Has the pandemic, do you think, exposed the cracks and the fault lines in this cadre deployment at a time when we absolutely need the state to function properly and save lives and livelihoods?
Ja, ek dink ons sien nou alreeds vir meer as 'n dekade lank die effek van kaderontplooiing. Ons het dit gesien onder staatskaping. Ons moet onthou dat die Gupta-familie was een element van staatskaping. Hulle het die meganismes wat reeds bestaan het gebruik om hulle self te verryk. Maar kaderontplooiing het die fondasie gelê vir staatskaping. Wat ons nou sien is dat van dieselfde kaders wat nou in beheer is van die staat onder president Ramaphosa, is ook die mense wat nou in die tyd van die COVID-krisis die COVID-korrupsie gepleeg het. Ons sien dat korrupsie nie besig is om minder te word nie. Mense kan argumenteer dit raak meer. Ons het gesien dat die hoof van die spesiale ondersoekeenheid het gesê hy het nog nooit so iets gesien in sy lewe nie, soos wat nou gebeur het met COVID-korrupsie. So ek dink hierdie behoort 'n keerpunt vir ons te wees vanaand, waar die president opstaan en sê kaderontplooiing is fundamenteel die oorsaak van staatskaping in Suid-Afrika. Ons gaan wegdoen daarmee, ons gaan ophou polities inmeng en ons gaan seker maak dat mense op meriete aangestel word, want ons wil die beste mense vir die werk in die staatsdiens hê.
En laastens, Leon, kan kaderontplooiing grondwetlik geregverdig word?
Ja, dit is iets waarna ons ook baie ernstig kyk. Ek glo dat kaderontplooiing nie voldoen aan artikel 197.3 van die grondwet nie. Hierdie artikel maak dit baie duidelik dat geen persoon, geen werknemer van die staatsdiens bevoordeel of benadeel mag word op grond daarvan dat hulle 'n spesifieke politieke party ondersteun nie. Ek dink kaderontplooiing is 'n skreiende verbreeking van hierdie grondwetlike reg en ek dink wat ook baie belangrik is dat kaderontplooiing ondermyn ook die reg op gelykheid. En gelykheid is een van die kernregte wat in ons handves van menseregte verskans word, want kaderontplooiing sê doeteenvoudig dat ANC-lede is meer gelyk as ander Suid-Afrikaners. Hulle het 'n groter reg om aangestel te word in die staatsdiens omdat hulle lojaal is aan die ANC, nie omdat hulle die beste mense vir die werk is nie.
Baie dankie vir jou bydrae, Leon. Ons waardeer dit en bly gerus ingeskakel. Gents, cadre deployment. It's one of those issues that has been highlighted a lot recently, and John Steenhuisen as well spoke about it as a very, very serious issue. And as Leon was saying, one of the issues is you have people in positions, and here we're thinking a lot about state-owned enterprises, who just drop the ball time and time again. Sorry?
Yeah, look, I think what cadre deployment has done is to infest the civil service with politicians and unqualified people who shouldn't be in the public service, because there's got to be that clear separation between the party and the state. And what it has done is it has become so infested in the public service, particularly in senior management level, that you have individuals who, even when they act with impunity because they are too closely associated with a powerful faction in the ANC that is in charge at the time. And what you see is the replication of senior managers who get fired from other spheres of government, and then they rise becoming, director generals or going into state-owned enterprises, because again, there is no clear consequence or blacklisting for people who have been found for unethical behavior in government that has compromised service delivery. I mean, Leon makes a very important point, and he has driven an issue in Parliament where if you look at the size of the civil service, there are 29,000 senior managers who are earning over R1 million in the public service. And many of those are people that are linked to politicians in the ANC. And that is why you'll find that some of these ministers even defy the most common sense there is in doing the right thing, because they're being covered up in the administration by the accounting authority. And the separation of powers exists so that politicians don't have undue influence in the running of the administration.
And again, no consequences. We come back to that all the time. There's just no consequences. Our next Zoom participant is ready. It is Dean McPherson, the DA Shadow Minister of Trade and Industry. Welcome, Dean, and thank you so much for joining us. The various lockdown levels have all but destroyed many businesses. And we need to know what is the true extent of this devastation.
Hi, Richard, and fellow panelists. Well, I think it's been absolutely devastating. We know that from a study from the Department of Small Business that 47% of small businesses closed due to the lockdown crisis inflicted on the country by the ANC. Business has simply no way to know what is coming in the future. They're continuously required to trade on an on-off situation. The 1 minute they can trade, the next minute they are being locked down due to regulation, and no business can survive in an environment like that. And I think that it's becoming very clear that this government has a very serious credibility crisis when it comes to being pro-growth and pro-jobs. Now, you'll remember that President Ramaphosa ascended to the presidency of the ANC on being exactly that, the business-friendly, pro-growth person who was going to put South Africa back on track. And in fact, under his leadership, it's been exactly the opposite. So I think that that there's a very serious economic crisis that we find ourselves in, and we are not going to get out of it unless we grow our way to prosperity. And that's going to require very clear government policies that put entrepreneurship and small business and industry at the very center of government thinking.
And is that what we need to hear tonight to restore some kind of hope for South Africans that we are still development and investment-friendly country?
Well, I think anything short of that is going to completely destroy the president's own investment drive of $100 billion. I've just seen a report published today that showed that, in fact, his FDI targets and investments into South Africa has halved over the last 12 months. And I think that speaks to the continuous problem of contradictory policy and double-speak within government, that they are pro-growth, but pro-expropriation without compensation. Unions continuously run rampant over government thinking, causing government to buckle at every opportunity. And then, of course, we have devastating policies like BBBEE, which, if you look at the Zondo Commission, along with Cadre deployment, have been at the real forefront of state capture. Now, the president made a very unfortunate comment when he said that they were going to use the vaccine rollout as an opportunity to create business opportunities for businesses aligned to the ANC. Now, that sort of talk and comment is just simply not acceptable when we need to use the might of industry, when we need to use the professionalism of the private sector to save lives and livelihoods. We shouldn't be looking to give opportunities to cadres based on their proximity to politicians. And we know that remains the single biggest concern for our big trading partners like the European Union.
Thank you very much for your input tonight, Dean. We'll certainly be keeping an eye on that critical part of our economy. Another critical sector that has been knee-halted by the lockdown and the waves of COVID is that of education, already faltering in many respects before COVID. The past year has been immensely difficult for our learners in this country, and we're now joined on Zoom by the DA Shadow Minister of Basic Education, Bax Nodada. Thank you for joining us, Bax. Another delayed school opening. What chances do the learners have of catching up, and do you think there's going to be long-term implications of these disruptions?
Good evening, Richard, and good evening to all the panelists. There definitely will be long-lasting effects on these extensions and the delay in the academic year, and what COVID has had an impact on the schooling system in South Africa. The Ministerial Advisory Committee has advised that it will take up to 10 to 15 years just to get to the point where we were, which in fact is not very far, Richard. And I think there's going to be a massive shift on what needs to be done. We already have an extension of 2 weeks with no scientific backing as to why the schooling system had to be pushed back, meaning in essence we've lost over 50 days. And with many provinces that we visited in the past week, Gauteng, Eastern Cape and KZN, not having a plan on how to recover that lost time, despite losing a lot of time in the previous year, in terms of making sure that we get schooling going in the country. So it's going to have long-term effects, especially now that we've got over 10,000 learners unaccounted for since level 5 that have dropped out. There's a drop in terms of our maths and science. The results have just recently come out. And there's poor results in terms of reading, writing, and maths itself. So that's where the challenge is, and that's what these effects have. We might not see them today, but definitely we'll see them as the time goes.
Well, thank you very much for that, Bax. Very sobering details there, and something we definitely have to keep an eye on. I mean, this is something, as you were saying, that we're going to feel much further down the line. But I'm just getting some information now that the federal leader, John Steenhuisen, is ready at Parliament. He's on the steps of Parliament, and he's ready to give us an indication of what his key expectations are for tonight. So it's over to Parliament.
Hi, John. Thank you so much for talking to us. What are your key expectations for tonight? What ground must Ramaphosa cover tonight?
I think there's three key areas the President's going to have to traverse this evening if he wants to exit this with any credibility. I call them the three V's. It's vaccine, it's vaults, and it's violations. Vaccines. We've got to have a rollout plan that's going to show how the country's going to get vaccinated so that we can prevent a third or potential fourth wave from happening, crippling the economy further, more lockdowns, more bans, more government control. Countries around the world have already vaccinated significant parts of their populations. We're yet today to have vaccinated a single person in South Africa. Vaults, Eskom. We need a plan around electricity. Basic electricity supply is a fundamental for any economic growth to happen in the economy. We need manufacturing jobs. We need lots of them to stem the jobs bloodbath that's hit South Africa. We've got to be able to attract foreign direct investment. That cannot happen. Eskom is a symptom of a broader problem of state control, state monopoly. The state must determine everything. We've got to take power away from that state and give it back to the people inside. We've got to give people their power back, and that's what we've got to do absolutely essentially. Then violations. Elephant in the room, the Zondo Commission revelations that have come out. State security agency subverting democracy, infiltrating the judiciary, infiltrating the media to spin. This is a scandal of biblical proportions, and the President cannot avoid it. He's going to have to explain to South Africa what he intends to do about it and how he's going to take action against those people responsible. For 3 years, he sat on that report. In the interim, he's promoted people implicated in that report into his government. This is a huge, huge issue the President is simply not going to avoid. And then jobs. We've got to hear about jobs. South Africans need to be working. South Africa needs to be working. We need concrete plans. 3 years of SONAs, of bullet trains, cities in the sky, dreams, hopes, aspirations isn't going to cut it this year. We need concrete action plans for which the opposition and society and viewers at home are able to hold the President and his government accountable to. Litany of broken promises. He comes into the SONA on the back of those broken promises. Big credibility problem. The President doesn't deal with the big issues tonight. He leaves tonight's SONA a dead man walking. The enemies of growth in his own party will start to amass forces. We're already seeing the sand shifting under Ramaphosa's feet. Tea parties happening as enemies are coalescing. A few wrong moves tonight by the President. No big bold reforms. It's more of the same, and that's a terrible trajectory that the President doesn't want to find himself on.
So, John, everyone's talking about vaccines and when we'll be able to achieve a sufficient rollout to reach herd immunity. Now, you've spearheaded the legal action to compel government to release their rollout plan. Why is this so important?
It's important because we have to have a detailed plan about how many vaccines we're getting, when they're arriving, how they're going to be administered, who's being prioritized, what centers are going to be used, which vaccines that we're using. Government's already covered itself in absolute shame and embarrassment, first of all by being left way behind in the vaccine race, not dealing with it last year in other countries, which meaning we're now scrabbling around the world looking for scraps and leftovers from other countries. The vaccines that they have imported are almost at expiry date and are hopelessly insufficient, and now the efficacy has been called into question. We need to understand where these vaccines are going to come from. If we don't reach that critical herd immunity as quickly as possible, we're going to have a third or fourth wave. Government now needs to, and that's what's behind our Vaccines Now campaign, needs to approve a variety of vaccines and tell the private sector in the country, medical aids, hospital groups, go out into the world and find vaccines. We need as many vaccines as quickly as possible in South Africa. It shouldn't be another government monopoly. We're going to leave it to government to centralize this rollout. You're going to end up with rolling blackouts like we have with Eskom.
Thank you so much, John. We'll be speaking to you later on. Back to you, Richard.
So I think...
Well, thank you very much to John Steenhuisen. We look forward to chatting to John again later this evening. Gentlemen, the three V's. We've spoken about vaccines quite extensively. Vaults, the Eskom disaster that we're facing, violations, the Zondo Commission. I mean, that's worth an entire program on its own anyway. But if we look at some of the promises over the past 10 years, under corruption, there's been a total of 10 promises made to curb corruption. On average, every speech has a promise to take control of the problems and deal with them. And Solly, as you were saying before we went across there, who's been prosecuted? Who's in jail? It's just empty promises. And as John was saying, we can't have this anymore.
Absolutely. And the other mistake that we often make in interpreting that is to expect that the only consequence is jail time. Firing people who are involved in corruption is a direct indication that there's consequences for that. And you've got a president who outsources taking decisions to investigations, because what that does is to protect him from taking a stand against his comrades in his own organization. Because the first powerful indicator of his intolerance for corruption would be to say, those fellow comrades that have been mentioned extensively at the Zondo Commission, some of whom have been fingered in the Auditor General's report, to start cleansing cabinet of those. But we know that he's constrained in doing so because he needs to keep the balance of forces in the factions in the ANC to do so. And John is absolutely right that if he doesn't come out strongly on the reforms today, he's going to be a dead man walking, because internally he will be weaker. Externally, the country's faith in his leadership will continue to erode. So he has an opportunity to be the president that the country needs, or to be the president that is beholden to the faction in the ANC. And he has, at each and every juncture, chosen the latter.
And on the vaccines, Asher, what John was saying as well is we can't just say, okay, you guys have got this, you deal with it, just let us know when it's happening. No, we need to involve as many people as possible. And you were saying, for you, this is a critical issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we do not get the private sector involved, it's going to continue to be botched. The reality of the matter is, by centralizing procurement, we have seen the same mistakes being repeated. Every time the state has centralized procurement to a single source, it has always botched it one way or another, whether it's through mass corruption or just wholesale incompetence. Nothing gets done. And the fact that, we're seeing, I saw a graphic in the New York Times, that at least 10% of the American population has now had one dose of its vaccine. South Africa, the total number of vaccinations administered is 0 at this stage. We're seeing Morocco move ahead of us. We're seeing countries with far fewer resources actually able to get this done, because it's becoming a national effort. Your private sector, everyone, a whole of society approach that really gets these things done. But in South Africa, we're not seeing that at all. And unless the president moves beyond this idea that the state can do everything when he's built and administered an incapable state, we're not going to get to the population immunity we need, and then we're not going to see an end to this crisis. But what we are going to see a longer jobs bloodbath, and we're going to see more people suffering in the streets without food, without resources, without jobs.
And Volts, talking about Eskom, talking about load shedding. I mean, we had it just 24 hours ago. We had stage 3 load shedding. And I heard a fact the other day that it's now 15 years. We've been having load shedding for 15 years. Yeah. And that's horrific. And I mean, we also have a list of how many times it's been promised that it's now over. It's fixed. It's not going to, it's not going to happen. 15 years of load shedding, Solly.
It's a long time, and it goes back to the fundamental point that both John and Asho makes, the state's obsession with running every aspect of governance and society in our country, because time and over again, it has proven to be incapable, but also dysfunctional when it has the little responsibilities it has to run a very efficient program of energy generation. And there's been resistance from that. There's been pushback from that. I mean, if you look at the history of where Medupi and Kusile power stations are now, and where they should be, and what amounts of millions have been spent in trying them to get them running and functioning, it shows that the state itself does not have the capacity to continue taking over these mandates and aspects of society that it wants to do. So while you can speak about, the president can speak about, the increased funding that they will fund to broaden the public service space. The reality is that in those areas, we're still dealing with load shedding even now. And we have shown in government where and some of the DA local governments such as Stellenbosch are moving into the terrain where residents in the areas won't be able to encounter load shedding because we are embracing, alternative energy generation, but also making sure that we look after our assets very well.
Very true. And if we look at, I think 338 million is the number spent on those 2 power stations up until now. We could have vaccinated everyone in the country 36 times with that money. Wow. Now over to another issue that is also a very hot button issue in South Africa. And we are joined on our Zoom by the chairperson of the DA Parliamentary Caucus, Annelie Lotriet. Baie dankie dat jy by ons aangesluit het, Annelie. Baie welkom. Vertel ons meer van die wetsontwerp wat die parlement tans oorweeg en waarom Suid-Afrikaners bekommerd moet wees hieroor.
Goeienaand, Richard. Ja, ons moet inderdaad bekommerd wees oor die onteieningswetsontwerp wat tans voor die parlement dien. Wel, dit is ter tafel gelê en daar is tans 'n openbare deelnameproses waar die burgers van die land die geleentheid gaan kry om hulle mening daaroor te lig. Nou, hierdie is geweldig belangrik. As ons dink, en ons praat vanaand oor die staatsrede, een van die voorlopers van die staatsrede is gewoonlik die president se Januarie 8 verklaring. En daarin het hy juis aangedui dat onteiening sonder vergoeding versnel sal word. En hierdie onteieningswetsontwerp gaan juis ook oor onteiening sonder vergoeding. Nou, mens moet dit ook nie afsonderlik sien van byvoorbeeld die artikel 25 proses nie. En dit is die 18de grondwetlike wysigingswetsontwerp waarmee ons tans ook in die parlement besig is. En hierdie 2 stukke wetgewing praat met mekaar. Maar as ons kyk na die onteieningswetsontwerp, wat is die groot probleme wat ons in die gesig staar? Eerstens moet ons besef dat eiendomsreg is die hoeksteen van enige demokrasie. Dit is wat vir jou ekonomiese krag gee in 'n land. En die oomblik wat jy daardie eiendomsreg nou in die lug laat hang en onsekerheid skep as gevolg van 'n stuk wetgewing en veral die gevaar van onteiening sonder vergoeding, want dit kan heeltemal arbitrair gedoen word, ook as ons kyk na die wetsontwerp, alhoewel daar gesê word daar is baie wigte en teenwigte, checks and balances, moet mense baie fyn lees. En eerstens is dit, wat presies is eiendom? Nou as ons kyk na die wetsontwerp, verwys dit na artikel 25 van die grondwet, en daar verwys dit dat eiendom word nie beperk tot grond nie. En dis presies wat hierdie wetsontwerp ook sê, dit gaan nie beperk wees tot grond nie. So dit is nie net landbougrond nie, dit kan jou intellektuele eiendomsreg wees, dit kan enigiets wees. So ons moet geweldig versigtig wees oor presies wat word bedoel as ons praat van onteiening van wat, van watter eiendom. En tweedens is ons groot probleem met die feit dat daar word sekere voorwaardes gestel vir wanneer daar 0 vergoeding moet wees. Nou 0 vergoeding beteken dat jy moet baie seker maak dat daar 'n billike en regverdige proses gevolg is. En op hierdie stadium, as mens die wysigingswetsontwerp vir die grondwet lees en jy kyk na hierdie wetsontwerp, dan lyk dit asof dit heeltemal ten gunste van die staat is. Daar word 5 omstandighede gegee waar daar 0 vergoeding kan wees. Maar die probleem is hierdie 5 voorwaardes of omstandighede is nie beperk nie. En soos wat die artikel 25 wysiging gaan lyk, of wat die ANC probeer doen, lyk dit asof die howe tot op die heel laaste uitgeskuif gaan word wanneer 'n proses op hersiening geneem kan word. So dit is absoluut tot nadeel van die burgers van hierdie land, van enige iemand wat eiendom besit.
And ironically enough, people think that the DA's opposition to this bill means that we're opposed to land reform. But in fact, we're the only major party who stands for meaningful land reform.
Inderdaad, dit is een van die groot valshede wat verkondig word, is die feit dat ons juis ten gunste is van grondhervorming. En ek dink as ons kyk na ons rekord in die Wes-Kaap, is ons die enigste party wat werklik positiewe, werklike grondhervorming teweegbring. Want vir ons beteken jou eiendomsreg is gekoppel aan die toekoms van die land. Dit is gekoppel aan ons ekonomie. En ons het net nou gehoor hoe swak ons ekonomie is en wat die probleme is. So ons kan nie nog soveel onsekerhede in die proses toelaat nie. Maar ons uitgangspunt is dat grondhervorming moet vinniger gebeur. Die probleem is dat dit nie vinnig genoeg gebeur nie as gevolg van die ANC-regering se korrupsie, politieke onwilligheid en die totale wanvermoë, die onbekwaamheid van die staat. Dit is die probleem. nie die onteiening of die grond of die grondhervorming nie. Dit is juis die staat se vermoë om dit te kan implementeer.
Baie dankie Annelie vir jou bydrae. Bly gerus ingeskakel. Land reform, emotive subject, but also one that's riddled with fake news and intentional misinformation. And as Annelie was saying, that there is an intentional misinformation campaign to say that the DA doesn't believe in land reform purely because we have issues with this bill.
Yeah, well, the reality is that you can't actually have meaningful land reform without securing private property rights. First, it's a fundamental. If you look at every single country that has reformed itself economically, got itself onto a growth path, created jobs. One of the key reforms, whether you look at China or Vietnam, is the fact that they introduced protections for property and investment across the board, intellectual property, private property, land, and so on. So what you end up doing with this policy of expropriation without compensation is creating massive amounts of uncertainty. That means that people who do have the skills and the capacity, and there are many, many black South Africans who do, are not going to actually make the investment, firstly. Secondly, you see the state treating some of the beneficiaries absolutely atrociously, not actually giving them full title, which means that they can't actually leverage their land, their property, into loans to then make it a productive asset. And you will not be able to get any loans if your property is at risk of being expropriated without compensation. So meaningfully, it means absolutely nothing. Of course, the DA is in favor of meaningful land reform that ensures that we identify beneficiaries who actually want to engage in agriculture, and that we have a systematic process built on the willing buyer, willing seller principle that transfers land, transfers skills, and ensures that everybody who has the capacity to do so can do so. But that's a process. It requires hard work, and it's much easier to swing a populist slogan than to actually meaningfully deal with the problem.
Yeah, and Solly, I don't think a large section of the population actually get what it actually means.
No, absolutely. But I mean, there is a deliberate strategy as to why it serves the government to do that, because it is one of the tools that it used to drive, inequality in society, but also to inflate, social tension in our country, because it becomes a mobilizing factor for the ANC to mobilize votes on. But let us look at the legacy of the ANC's land reform programs in government. It has only a success rate of 10%. I mean, you can't even refer to 10% as a success rate, but what it shows you is that 90% of the ANC government's land reform program have failed and collapsed simply because they are on the wrong side of ideas. They are misinformed in terms of providing ultimate ownership to the beneficiaries. And the most important part of a land reform program has to also address communal land ownership. And unless it ultimately makes sure that people in communal land get a sense of ownership, it fails to drive the empowerment that it would seek and have in uplifting these people's lives. So the spin around the DA's somehow opposition to this is misinformed, because it serves the ANC's purpose to use land as a polarizing issue to mobilize votes on. And Asho has outlined what the DA's position on land reform is.
And just a quick message out there to anybody who may just have joined us. This is the DA's coverage of the 2021 State of the Nation Address. We're talking to our DA shadow ministers on a range of very critical and important topics. And my studio guests and I are also discussing what is anticipated tonight, and we are crossing to Parliament to speak to the federal leader John Steenhuisen and others from our parliamentary grouping during the course of the evening. We will also be bringing you the State of the Nation address live, after which we will discuss it. And talking of shadow ministers, the DA shadow minister joining us now on Zoom is Kevin Milam, Shadow Minister of Mineral Affairs and Energy. Thanks for joining us, Kevin. And I'm sure no one needs reminding that this week, again, we were plunged into darkness by the dreaded load shedding, as if dealing with a pandemic wasn't enough. Kevin, is there an end in sight?
Well, Richard, it appears as if we're stuck with load shedding for the foreseeable future. We like to refer to it as rolling blackouts, because that's essentially what it is. Eskom is completely dysfunctional, and it's unable to meet the demand of South Africa. So this obviously impacts on our ability to deal with the COVID pandemic as well. How do we keep ventilators on? How do we keep vaccines at the correct temperature if we can't keep the power on and the lights on? We've also heard promises time and again from President Ramaphosa and various ministers of how Eskom is being turned around. And the reality is that this just isn't true. We are seeing reports that show that their energy availability factor is at an all-time low, and also that roughly 27% of their fleet is non-functional at any given time right now for unplanned outages. So Eskom themselves are admitting they're not able to deal with this crisis. Just this week, we heard that they had spent 47 billion rand over the last 10 years on diesel to offset the impact of load shedding. Now that gives you an idea of the extent of the crisis. And to make matters worse, they don't have the financial resources to build new generation capacity, which is why we urgently need to bring the private sector on board in the form of independent power producers. We need to open up our grid and actively encourage investment and competition.
Kevin, you've been lobbying aggressively for the IPPs to come online. Talk to us a little bit about the IPPs and what can they offer?
Well, IPPs are basically privately owned power stations. There's a misconception that when we talk about IPPs, we're only talking about renewable energy, and that simply isn't the case. It includes private generation from gas, coal, and other sources of energy too. Among the things that IPPs bring to the table that Eskom cannot is build speed. We've seen, Solly mentioned it earlier, how long it took to build Medupi and Kusile and the corruption that became entrenched there. Typically, an IPP is either a single company or a consortium who will build, own, and operate the generation facility and sell the electricity that they generate either to the grid or to private or municipal customers, and that then generally leads to lower costs in the long term as well.
And Kevin, we've seen and heard from a number of DA-led municipalities. You and I were on a show earlier where we were talking about these municipalities that want to make moves to become energy resilient. Some people are saying, but that's much further down the line. But how close are we to be able to do something like this?
Richard, we only really got the opportunity towards the end of last year when the minister amended Schedule 2 of the Electricity Regulation Act. And the first steps are already being taken by a number of DA municipalities, notably Stellenbosch and George. Stellenbosch already has a wheeling bylaw in place, which allows areas and businesses with a surplus of electricity to wheel it to areas and businesses where there's demand. And George is busy putting a similar bylaw in place right now. Stellenbosch are also at the forefront of investigating alternative sources of electricity other than Eskom, which will ultimately make them electricity independent. Those sources include possible own supply, as well as purchasing directly from independent power producers. Other DA municipalities, like the city of Cape Town, are pursuing an energy efficiency route where they are looking at how they can save electricity, and they're putting solar panels on their roofs, which ultimately reduces their demand from Eskom and their price, the cost that they have to pay for that electricity. So what you can see is that DA municipalities across the country are actively seeking solutions to our electricity crisis. They're looking for ways that they can get out of the situation that Eskom has created and gain this independence. The reality, however, is that we're 2 to 3 years away at the earliest from the initial results, and probably 3 to 5 years for a more widespread outcome.
Kevin, thank you so much for your enlightening contribution. It's been a lot more enlightening than Eskom has been for many citizens in the last week or so. So thank you very much for that, and we'll be looking out for any comment on that. Thank you for joining us there. But surely the coal just got wet. This is what we hear. I mean, Kevin gave us a very clear indication of all the problems, and yet we hear conveyor belt broke, the coal got wet. I mean, South Africans need options.
Well, there's one simple fact, and that is Eskom was producing more energy 2 decades ago than it is right now. And I'm sure coal was getting wet 2 decades ago as well. Rain is not a new phenomenon. I'm pretty certain for my entire adult life and my childhood as well, I've seen rain. So I somehow think that the problem, well, we all know, the problem is considerably deeper than that. It is years of neglect followed by years of corruption. Yeah. And the fact is that Eskom's problems become a hard constraint to economic growth in this country. I did read an analysis that said that South African economy cannot grow by more than 2% per annum, because if it did, we would have a national collapse of the energy grid, because there's not enough electricity to sustain growth beyond that, which means we can't deal with unemployment, we cannot deal with getting food into households, and we cannot actually deal with the bigger problems until we deal with Eskom. That's why John, of his 3 Vs, Volts was the big one. And it's absolutely critical. The fact that we are now with the lockdowns and decimation of industry, it's probably some of the lowest periods of electricity demand in this country, seeing that we're now in stage 3 with threats of maybe even more, tells us that actually Eskom is now, it's not a national asset, it's a national hindrance. And we need to move more quickly towards private energy supply all over the country, decentralized, getting into the system, so that we can actually have a stable energy future, which means that we can have a stable economic future at the very least.
Very important point there. Like water, if we don't have a stable, uninterrupted supply, we can't really talk about growing any economy.
No, absolutely. And another key element to the problem, the twin problems that Asho identified, is that Eskom just hasn't had consistent periods of stable leadership, be it at CEO level and at board level. And what that does, it erodes trust, industry trust in the entity. And some of these problems that have, happened over time with regards to neglect, underinvestment in its generation capacity, is because of the corruption that has opportunistically been allowed to take place because of the lack of stable leadership in there. So, to add to Asho's point, it's not a state asset anymore. In fact, it's a state liability, and it's become a liability even to the economy of the country, because no matter how much we go on an attractive drive to attract investment, the reality is that Eskom won't cope with the demand to supply uninterrupted electrical supply for the country and investment to run smoothly. And no investor wants to get into a space where they can't predict the stability of electricity supply.
Yeah, that's an awful catch-22 situation there. Just a reminder to our viewers that we will be crossing to the National Assembly at 7 o'clock for that State of the Nation address by President Ramaphosa. But now our final Zoom participant for this evening is joining us, the Shadow Minister of Finance, Jordan Hill-Lewis. Good evening, Jordan, and thank you so much for joining us. As we've been discussing tonight, South Africa is in the midst of a jobs and economic bloodbath. What is it going to take to stem the bleeding and to get the economy back on track?
Richard, Solly, Asho, it's really great to be with you for this DATV initiative. It's fantastic to see. This is all about credibility, Richard. If the president cannot convince the country, if he cannot convince small business owners and people who have lost their jobs through this devastating lockdown, 2.5 million of them now, if he cannot convince them that he is serious about economic reform, then the speech will fall completely flat and it will have no credibility. So reform is the watchword. Is he going to take the tough decisions, the bold leadership decisions required to take the economy out of the hands of the control of the state, out of the paradigm that sees the state at the center of all development, and into the hands of private business people? Entrepreneurs who are growing their businesses and working so hard every day to grow our economy and create jobs. And they've had a really tough time of it. So speaking to you tonight, I think in particular of small business owners across the country who might be watching this and their employees, many of whom have had a terrible year. And we hope, what we expect from the president tonight is a serious commitment to reform so that your businesses, so that your jobs can get up and running again.
And we've seen that COVID expenditure has reached astronomical proportions, and there are serious questions as to whether South Africa can maintain this level of spending that we need to, especially with vaccines and things that we really need to be spending money on. Is there enough money? Where can we source it from? We spoke about SAA earlier. We need to find money.
Of course, there's definitely enough money, Richard. Look, South Africa faces a financial crisis, let there be no mistake. Our problem is not a lack of resources. Our problem is what we spend those resources on, Richard. We waste so much money in this government on South African Airways, on Eskom. Eskom, by the way, as we go through another bout of terrible load shedding, will get 56 billion rand from us, the public, this year alone. So it's SAA, it's Eskom, it's fancy government parties and blue light brigades and bodyguards and so on. The list of examples is endless of the incredible waste in our government. And what that means is that there's not enough money for basic essentials in times of crisis, like the vaccine, as you've correctly said. Ordinarily, under a DA government, there would absolutely be enough money to fund a full and comprehensive vaccine program, because we would not be wasting money on vanity projects and parties and bailing out failing companies. So yes, there is enough money.
And Jordan, people sort of look to the international markets as well to see and make judgments on where we are. From your experience, what are the overseas markets thinking when it comes to South Africa? Are we too much of a risk?
We absolutely are too much of a risk. There's very little to sell South Africa as an investment destination at the moment, Richard. We've got to really kind of make a case on patriotism and love for the potential of the country, because our government is doing everything possible to chase investors away. So it's a tough sell at the moment, but that doesn't mean that we're not positive. We do believe that where the DA governs, we can still be attracting investment and attracting new businesses. And of course, that's why we want to grow and win in more places, so that we can attract investors to those places, grow the economy and grow jobs.
Thank you very much for that contribution, Jordan. We'll be keeping a close eye on what comes out of the State of the Nation tonight. Thank you so much. I'm being told that we now are crossing to Parliament. I'm sure the people are starting to get in and take their seats and get ready to listen to that State of the Nation address by President Ramaphosa. We're crossing now to Parliament. To the pomp and splendor, bells and whistles, pageantry that normally goes on. That's a very desolate looking parliamentary space, isn't it?
It was even more empty than it is on a regular business day. It's particularly quiet. I'm used to it being some sort of hive of activity of some kind. But this year obviously is a very different year. I think this is the first SONA we'll have under these conditions, and I hope the last. But it is what it is, and we look at it at a very strange picture this year.
And as Natasha was saying, there's still a lot of the police that have to be there, the security that have to be there. But from 7 o'clock, that's when it needs to be business as usual. And it was mentioned a few times. Solly, you mentioned it. Jordan mentioned it. John mentioned it. Time to step up. The president has to step up.
This is the moment to do so. And as I said earlier, this is the moment where, if the president truly wants to be the president of the country and show the bold leadership that the country has been yearning for, this is the moment to do it, because he has had more opportunities than any other state president to have national addresses to the public in the last few months than any president has had. So this is an opportunity to showcase the courageous leadership, because let us also remember, this is a president who campaigned on a new era of political reforms, economic reforms, on transparency in government, on pursuing excellence in government. And we've had all the possible noise you could ever hear about that. Now is the time for deliverables, because it's his third SONA. The first two SONAs, you could excuse him for acclimatizing to the realities of government, which is something that he clearly wasn't fully aware of when he made those campaigns. But this is the moment to step up. And what will happen beyond the State of the Nation address of today will become the legacy of the Ramaphosa presidency.
I see the pictures we're getting from Parliament, the media also taking up their positions there, obviously waiting for the SONA to finish. They can speak to the leaders of obviously the DA and some of the other parties represented there tonight. But I think if there's one thing that has stood out in the build-up to this, is that John and his team have come out and said, we have solutions, we have options, we have alternatives. Listen to us, let us be part of the solution.
Yeah, well, the party has produced, as Natasha said earlier, the Blue Book, which we've handed the presidency, detailing for every single department, not only the problems we've identified, but solutions, alternatives on the table. The DA often gets criticized for not presenting its solutions, so we've tried to be as productive as we can. We've consulted as many experts as we could in everything from basic education to finance to health, and handed it across. Of course, let's see if he says anything tonight that is a DA suggestion, or if he's put it in the paper shredder. We don't know yet. I suppose we'll find out. But yeah, the president, as Sally said, has got to, if he's going to make any bold reforms, the best time to do it is in the middle of a crisis.
Yeah.
I mean, given a crisis, and nobody ever wants to be in power at the peak of a crisis, but he has one. And now is, time to make hay while the sun shines, as they say, and actually step up. And if he's going to lead the country, he's going to have to do so in spite of his party, and he's going to have to drag his party kicking and screaming with him over the finish line to say, these are the things we have to do to get the country back on track. And if he's unable to do that tonight, he's not going to get another opportunity like this, as more and more of these factions that Solly has described entrench themselves in different government departments and begin to engage in trench warfare against him, as John Steenhuisen said. As you see the tea parties for the enemies of growth happening, you begin to see more and more how these various factions find ways to frustrate any sort of reform agenda, any sort of growth agenda that gets South Africans back to work and that deal with corruption very quickly. So he's got to start, and tonight's his opportunity. If he doesn't do it tonight, I don't think we're going to see it. And people can wait and hope for another year, but it'll be waiting in vain. This is his only opportunity.
Well, we're getting some questions in from members of the public, and one of them is, how are we going to vote when the municipal elections have been stopped? That's from Barbara Schillinglaw. Now, we haven't heard anything about the municipal elections being stopped. There has been some talk of it and some claims by some of the other parties that it won't happen. But it's a critical year, an election year. It's a municipal election year, and this is not something that we can just brush off. This is something that our democracy needs.
Absolutely, and something that our democracy actually insists on. So it is not an option, but it is a constitutional requirement that we should be going into a municipal election this year. And by all indications, we should be going towards that because it's a requirement. But it also speaks to the strength of our democracy, and this is what an innovative government should be doing. I mean, as the DA, when it was clear that the COVID pandemic is going to disrupt the normal business of life, we had to be agile and adapt quickly enough to make sure that our operations run, and we adopted all the technological platforms that were there, to the extent that we even became the first political party to run a fully running electoral congress to do so. So it is up to the IEC to modify its infrastructure to make sure that the election happens, rather than to succumb to the political pressure that both the ANC and the EFF seem to be wanting to exert on it to abandon local government elections for this year. And it's something that, there will be a far strong pushback from the DA to make sure that we'll fulfill and meet the constitutional requirement for local government elections to take place.
For sure. And another question coming in touches on something we've already spoken about from Malungelo Ntloko. He says, why do we have to have such a bloated cabinet? Didn't the president promise to trim the fat a few years ago? Why are we buying cars and security for and bodyguards for these people? And this is something that has been touched on. It has been a promise made before, and no changes.
Well, he's made marginal changes the size of Jacob Zuma's excessively bloated cabinet to a bloated cabinet. From excessively bloated to bloated is not the change I think South Africans were looking for. And of course, they skirted around, we'll reduce the number of ministers, but then we'll have 2 deputy ministers in several ministries. And we know that deputy ministers have very little of a meaningful role. So what he's actually done is made sure that they maximize the patronage available in the system. But it runs deeper than that. Having the size, and Sally touched on this point earlier, as did Leon Schreiber, having the size of the state as it is, you start at the top, then multiplies its way down. You've got all the ministerial advisors, all of the Cadre deployments, you've got 29,000 managers who earn more than R1 million a year, but they have hangers on, as Sally described. They've got policy advisors and legal advisors and administrative support, all of whom look very busy doing very little. And that is not the way you administer a state. People have got to meet targets and deadlines and objectives and outcomes. And unless he starts structuring the entire state on targets and deadlines and outcomes, we're not going to see proper meaningful reform there either. you can create a department for small business, but unless you set targets to say, we're going to incubate this number of small businesses, we're going to ensure that they have access to finance from the private sector, etc., this is how we're going to do it, you're not going to have meaningful, impactful outcomes that actually improve the lives of ordinary people.
Okay, I can see on our screen the president is about to enter the actual chamber to do the address. Solly, any last expectations from your side?
Look, that moment is always a special moment when the president enters the chamber. I mean, we should never downplay the significance of what serving the public is all about. And, having been in the House for the last 6 times, it always reminds you of the aspirations that the country has and what, we expect of public leadership. And I hope that the president will understand that the best way to lead, as Asho indicated, in a time of crisis, is to never let it go to waste. To be courageous enough to serve the country. He took an oath to serve the country first, and always put the country first rather than his party.
I think we need to not make a mistake of looking at failures of any particular president or grouping and blame it on Parliament. Parliament as an institution is critical.
Yes, Parliament ensures that there's oversight, lawmaking and accountability. It ensures that every South African has a voice and every South African feels represented. And the myriad of perspectives we have in this country are given a voice, and then it's up to the executive arm of government, the president and his ministers, to take up the best ideas that are generated in Parliament. And this goes back to, we can't have this idea of all power to the party. It should be all power to Parliament, all power to the people, ultimately. And it is the people's house at the end of the day.
And we can't let, we do have a pandemic, but we can't let let Parliament happen. We still have to find ways, whether it is virtual or whatever, we can't stop Parliament.
No, the essence of leadership is that it exists and should exist despite the crises that it faces. So you don't choose to lead only during good times and easy times. The reality is that leadership gets tested during tough and difficult periods. And the pandemic represented that. But the country still needs to be led. Governance still needs to continue. Services still need to be delivered.
I see the speaker is just about to kick off. James, sitting in there, is there always a bit of sort of butterflies when this starts, when this kicks off? I mean, this is a critical part of our running our country.
Yes, well, it often is. It's a very proud moment to be able to sit in there and represent millions of South Africans and their hopes and dreams and aspirations. Every time you prepare for a big set piece like this, like the State of the Nation or the budget, you can't help but hope that what you're going to get is the reforms that South Africa so desperately needs, and that millions of people so desperately need to improve their lives. So it is always one of those moments where you sit a little bit anxious, waiting, hoping that this time will be different, and this time we hope it will be different.
And as you said, you have to remember, you're representing people.
Absolutely. I mean, the magnitude of the privilege is reserved for only 400 people to serve as members of parliament. And when you're in there, you get reminded one of the obligation you took to serve the country, but also to be that actor of bring up solutions to make sure that our country functions and protecting our constitution. Because too often people think that opposition members should exist to help the government govern well. We are in there to make sure that the constitution of the country functions at all times. And it's our duty to be that voice during oversight, during accountability platforms such as the committees, but also in presenting the alternative solutions that the DA consistently puts on the table, be it in committees or in the real State of the Nation address.
President has taken his position. Let's sit back for the State of the Nation 2021.
Speaker of the National Assembly, Ms. Thandi Modise, Chairperson of the National Council of Provinces, Mr. Amos Masondo, Deputy President of the Republic, David Dabete Mambuza, former President Thabo Mbeki and Mrs. Mbeki, former Deputy President Phumzile Mlambo Ngcuka, former Deputy President Baleka Mbete, Chief Justice Mogoeng and Deputy Chief Justice Zondo, and all esteemed members of the judiciary, ministers and deputy ministers, premiers of our provinces, members of the National Assembly, speakers from the various legislatures, members of the National Council of Provinces, the Dean of the European Union region representing the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished guests and members and fellow South Africans. On this day, 31 years ago, President Nelson Mandela walked out of the gates of Victor Verster prison, a free person, a living embodiment of the resilience and courage of the people of South Africa. His release signaled great hope of better things to come. It actually signaled that the freedom of the people of South Africa was nigh. For nearly 40 million years, an extraordinary ecosystem has existed here at the southernmost tip of our continent. The fynbos, which stretches across the Cape, has among the most distinctive features of any plants that are found on our earth. It can adapt to dry and hot summers and cold and rainy winters. It is wondrous in its diversity. Our national flower, the protea, is a species of the fynbos. When I opened the 3rd National Investment Conference last year, I spoke of the protea's unique properties that in so many ways resembles our national culture. What is most unique and special about the fynbos that we find plentiful here in the Western Cape is that to be sustainable and to survive, the fynbos needs fire. At least once every 20 years, the fynbos must burn at extremely high temperatures to allow the ecosystem to be rejuvenated and to grow afresh. Throughout the summer, the burnt foliage of the fynbos lies desolate, but when the autumn rains return, the seeds explode and germinate, and its life cycle begins all over again. And it displays the splendor and the beauty that we often see when we look at the beautiful sights of the Western Cape. The mountains bloom with new life as plants which once seemed lost and dead grow back even stronger than ever before. We, the people of South Africa, have over the past year experienced a terrible tragedy and hardship. Like a wildfire that sweeps across the mountains and the mountainous ranges of our country, where the fynbos grows, a deadly pandemic has swept across the world, leaving devastation in its path. And yet, like the hardy fynbos of our native land, we too have proven to be resilient in many, many ways. For 300 for 3 centuries, we were victims as a people of oppression, dispossession, and injustice. And for 3 centuries, we resisted this. The flames of injustice may have scarred us, but they did not consume us or destroy us. The rains of democracy brought rejuvenation to our country, and they also brought the birth of a new nation. We have risen time and time again from the depths of darkness to herald a new dawn and a new day. As we look on the grave damage that this disease, coronavirus, has caused, we know that, like the Fynbos, like all those who have walked this land before us, we will rise again. Nearly a year has passed since South Africa saw the first case of the novel coronavirus, COVID-19. Since then, nearly 1.5 million people in our country are known to have been infected with the virus. More than 45,000 people are known to have died. Beyond these statistics lies a human story of tragedy and a human story of pain. There is no family, no community in our land, and no place of work that has not lost someone they knew, someone they worked with, and someone that they loved. It is also a story of courage and resilience. The resilience of the hospital worker who day after day, night after night, goes to work to save lives, knowing that they themselves are at risk of infection. It is a wonderful account of the courage of the police officer, the soldier, the essential worker, the caregiver, and all those on the front line who have kept our country safe, our people fed, and our economy going. It is a story of solidarity, and it is also a story of compassion, of a nation that has stood together to confront COVID-19 in ways not seen since the early days of our democracy. Along the way, as we were struggling with this virus, yes, mistakes were made. Yes, there was a lot of criticism, and it continues. But the fact of the matter is, we, the people of South Africa, have in the main stood together to fight this common enemy. More than anything else, this crisis has revealed the true character of our remarkable nation. It has revealed the spirit of the people who refused to be defeated by a virus. It is this South African spirit that must drive our resolve to build a new and more equal economy and a better and more just society. The year ahead must be a time for change, for progress, and also for rebirth. It must be a year in which we rise as a people and we do things that are going to make us rise. This is no ordinary year, and this is no ordinary State of the Nation address. I will therefore focus this evening on the 4 most overriding priorities that we have for 2021. They are not many, but they are focused. First, we must defeat the coronavirus pandemic. That is primary in everything that we have to do as a nation. And second, we must accelerate our economic recovery. Third, we must implement economic reforms to create sustainable jobs and drive inclusive growth. And finally, and not leaving many other things aside, but these are the key ones. And finally, we must fight corruption and strengthen the state that has been weakened. In the coming weeks, we will address other important elements of the government's program for the year as we move on. Fundamental to our nation's recovery is an unrelenting and comprehensive response to overcome the virus. South Africa has just emerged from the second wave of infections since COVID-19 arrived in our shores in March of last year. Driven by a new variant of the virus, this second wave was more severe and it cost many more lives than the first wave. Nevertheless, the human cost could have been far greater had we not moved quickly to restrict movement as well as activity, had we not prepared our health facilities, and had South Africans not observed the basic protocols of health, the devastation caused by the virus could have been far, far worse. This year, we must do everything in our means to contain and overcome the pandemic. This means intensifying our prevention, all the prevention efforts, and strengthening our health system. It also means that we must undertake a massive vaccination program to save lives and dramatically reduce infections across the entire population. Earlier this week, we were informed that one of the vaccines that we had procured, the AstraZeneca vaccine, offers minimal protection from mild to moderate infection by the new variant known as 501Y.V2. This is according to early findings of a study by our scientists and researchers. We applaud these scientists, and we really have outstanding scientists in our country. We applaud them for leading this research and providing new evidence that is vital for guiding our response to this pandemic. Since this variant is now the dominant variant in our country, these findings have significant implications for the pace, the design, as well as the sequencing of our vaccination program. While it should not delay the start of the vaccination program by much, it will affect the choice of vaccines and the manner of their deployment. The first phase of our vaccination program, which is targeted at health and other frontline workers, will now use the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which has been shown to be effective against 501Y. We have secured 9 million doses of Johnson & Johnson vaccine. The first batch of some 80,000 doses will arrive in the country next week. Further consignments will arrive over the next 4 weeks, totaling 500,000 Johnson & Johnson vaccines. All provinces have already rolled out their plans to enable the first vaccines to be administered. The Deputy President, David Mabuza, is leading an interministerial committee that is overseeing this massive rollout. I wish to thank our provinces for their level of preparedness for this massive undertaking that we are about to embark upon. In addition, we have secured 12 million vaccines from the COVAX facility. This will be complementing other vaccines that are available to South Africa through the African Union's Acquisition Task Team facility that we set up. Pfizer has committed 20 million vaccine doses, commencing with deliveries at the end of the first quarter. We are continuing our engagement with all vaccine manufacturers to ensure that we secure sufficient quantities of vaccines that are suitable for our conditions in terms of the variant that we have here. The health and safety of our people remains our paramount concern. All medication imported in South Africa are monitored, they are evaluated, they are investigated and inspected and registered by the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority. We will continue to use the science-driven approach that has served us so well since the earliest days of the pandemic. The success of the vaccination program will rely on active collaboration between all sectors of society. We are greatly encouraged by the active involvement of business, labor, health, industry players, as well as medical aid schemes, and in particular, in preparing for the mass vaccination drive that they've been involved in. As we have overcome before, we will overcome this challenge once again, and we will rise. But it is not just this disease that we must defeat. We must overcome poverty, hunger, joblessness, and the inequality in our country. We must overcome a legacy of exclusion and dispossession that continues to impoverish our people and which this pandemic has severely worsened. When I delivered the State of the Nation address in this House last year, none of us could have imagined how within a matter of weeks our country and our world would have changed so dramatically. Our plans had to be adapted in response to a global emergency. The budgets that we had crafted had to be reprioritized, and many programs that we had as government in our various departments, including in our provinces and our local government structures, had to be deferred. Over the past year, South Africa has experienced a sharp decline in growth and a significant increase in unemployment. Poverty is on the rise, inequality is deepening. In the third quarter of 2020, our economy was 6% smaller than it was in the last quarter of 2019. There were 1.7 million fewer people employed in the third quarter of 2020 than there were in the first quarter before the pandemic struck. Our unemployment rate now stands at a staggering 30.8%. As a result of the relief measures that we implemented and the phased reopening of the economy, we expect to see a strong recovery in employment by the end of the year. As we work to contain the spread of the virus, we also had to take extraordinary measures to support ordinary South Africans. We also had to assist businesses that were in distress and protect people's livelihoods. The social and economic relief package that we introduced in April of last year is by any account the largest intervention of its kind in the history of our country. It identified measures worth a total of 500 billion, or about 10% of our GDP, to provide cash directly to the poorest households, to provide wage support to workers, and to provide various forms of relief to struggling businesses. This had never been done in the history of our country. A total of 18 million people, or close to 1/3 of our population, received additional grant payments through these relief measures. It is estimated that this grant lifted more than 5 million people above the food poverty line, helping to alleviate hunger in a moment of great distress and crisis. To date, more than 57 billion in wage support has been paid to over 4.5 million workers through the special UIF TERF scheme. More than 1.3 billion has been provided in support, mainly for small and medium enterprises. In addition, over 70 billion rand in tax relief was extended to businesses in distress. Around 18 billion rand in loans have been approved for 13,000 businesses through the loan guarantee scheme that we put together. To fellow South Africans, it is nearly 4 months since I stood here before the joint sitting of this Parliament to present to the nation the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan. This evening, we stand here not to make promises, but to report on the progress in the implementation of the recovery plan, and also the priority actions that we need to take to restore growth and to create jobs. Since the launch of the plan, we have focused on 4 priority interventions: a massive rollout of infrastructure throughout the country, a massive increase in local production, an employment stimulus to create jobs and support livelihoods, and the rapid expansion of our energy generation capacity. We announced that we would be embarking on a massive rollout of infrastructure throughout the country. We knew that to achieve this objective, we would need to steadily rebuild the technical skills within government to prepare and to manage large infrastructure projects. These were skills that had been lost over time. We have now developed an infrastructure investment program, or project pipeline, that is worth 340 billion rand in network industries such as energy, water, transport, as well as telecommunications. Construction has already started, and progress is being made on a number of these projects. Since the announcement of the Reconstruction and Recovery Plan, we have launched 2 major human settlement projects that will provide homes to almost 68,000 households here in Gauteng. Well, not here in Gauteng in the north. Similar human settlement projects are planned all over the country in a number of other provinces. 2 years ago, I spoke about the dream of building new cities that will enable us to make a decisive break with apartheid special development. Many people laughed. Many scoffed the idea of new post-apartheid cities are being conceptualized in a number of places in our country, in a number of provinces. The Lanseria Smart City, the first new city to be built in a democratic South Africa, is now a reality in the making. The draft master plan for this smart city which will become home to between 350,000 to 500,000 people within the next decade, was completed in November 2020 and is now out for public comment. This is reality. It is happening as we speak. And we now have a number of local government structures cooperating to build this city. Progress is being made on several major water infrastructure projects. These include phase 2 of the Mogolo and Crocodile River project and the Nkomazi water project as well. The infrastructure investment plan identifies roads and projects worth 19 billion rand covering the spine of the South African road network. Work is underway to finalize project finance and structuring for these projects. Resources have been committed from the fiscus to support the construction and rehabilitation of the major N1, N2, and N3 highways. These infrastructure projects will lead to the revival of our construction industry and the creation of much-needed jobs. The 100 billion infrastructure fund is now in full operation. This fund will blend resources from the fiscus and financing from the private sector and development institutions. Its approved project pipeline for 2021 is varied and includes projects such as student housing infrastructure, which aims to provide 300,000 student beds. Another approved project is SA Connect, a program to roll out broadband to schools, hospitals, police stations, and other government facilities. The second priority intervention of the recovery plan is to support the massive increase in local production and to make South African exports globally competitive. This will encourage greater investment by the private sector in productive activity, and key to this plan is the renewed commitment from government, business, and organized labor to buy locally made products. And we've always been talking about localization and saying we encourage South Africans to buy local, to ensure that even what you wear, like the suit I'm wearing tonight, is locally made by South African workers. This commitment should lead to increased local production, which will lead to the revival of our manufacturing industry, which will lead to the employment of more and more of our people. If many of us men buy the suits that are made locally, more workers will be employed in the factories that make this suit. All social partners who participated in the development of the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan as part of our social compact have agreed to work together to reduce our reliance on imports by 20% over the next 5 years. They have identified 42 products ranging from edible oils to furniture to fruit concentrates to personal protective equipment, steel products, and green economy inputs that can be sourced locally, because if we focus our mind on buying local, entrepreneurs will start making them. And entrepreneurs will start exporting them and competing with the rest of the world. But it should start here at home with us. If we achieve our target, we will significantly expand our productive economy, potentially returning more than 200 billion rand to the country's annual output. Last year, we undertook to create a larger market for small business and designate 1,000 locally produced products that must be procured from small, medium enterprises. As the COVID-19 pandemic forced the closure of global value chains, we have been able to speed up the initiative as the local supply chains become more open for locally manufactured products. To this end, Cabinet approved the Small Medium Enterprise Focused Localization Policy Framework, which identified 1,000 products. Furthermore, the Department of Small Business Development and Trade and Industry and Competition are supporting small and medium enterprises to access larger domestic and international markets. I've been very impressed with the work that these two departments have been doing. These efforts are supported by robust manufacturing support programs. In the State of the Nation address last year, I said that our vision for industrialization is underpinned by sector master plans to rejuvenate and grow key industries. 4 master plans that have been completed and signed to date, which are part of the social compact between labor, business, and government and communities, have already had an impact in their respective industries. Through the implementation of the Poultry Master Plan, and remember our poultry industry was under a lot of stress. What the poultry industry needed was to have a master plan, which should have been arrived at, and it did happen on a compact basis. Now we're seeing progress in that industry. The industry has now invested 800 million rand to upgrade production. South Africa now produces an additional 1 million chickens every week. Now that is great progress. The Sugar Master Plan was signed during the lockdown with a commitment from large users of sugar to procure at least 80% of their sugar needs from local growers. Now, through the implementation of the plan last year, we saw a rise in local production and a decline in imported sugar, creating stability for an industry which employs well over 85,000 workers. Support for black small-scale farmers is being stepped up, with a large beverage producer committing to expand their procurement sharply and focusing on the small-medium enterprise producers. Now, since the signing of the Clothing, Textile, Footwear and Leather Master Plan in November in 2019, the industry has invested more than R500 million to expand local manufacturing facilities, including small-medium enterprises. We have worked closely with the auto sector to help it weather the pandemic. By the end of the year, the sector had recovered around 70% of its normal annual production in difficult circumstances. Last week, the Ford Motor Company announced a 16 billion rand investment to expand their manufacturing facility in Tshwane for the next generation Ford Ranger Bakkie, which they will export around the world to well over 150 countries. Now, this investment will support the growth of around 12 and more small-medium enterprises in the automotive component manufacturing, an area in which many black-owned small businesses have never really entered. Now, through this initiative and this investment, we are going to see a number of small-medium enterprises, largely in the Pretoria area, Mamelodi, Esterus and places like that, coming to the fore and becoming active and being productive. Nearly half of the procurement spend on construction of the bulk earthworks and top structure of the Tshwane Special Economic Zone during this phase is expected to be allocated to small medium enterprises, and I was told that it will be some 200 medium enterprises, and the value could well be something like 1.7 billion rand in procurement opportunities. Toyota has invested in their KwaZulu-Natal facility to start production of the first generation hybrid electric vehicles to come off a South African assembly line. Now, this follows investment announcements by Nissan, Mercedes-Benz, and Isuzu in expanded production facilities, all of which cement South Africa's position as a global player in auto manufacturing and the biggest on the African continent. This year, our focus will be on getting the industry back to full production, implementing the Black Industrialist Fund, and working on a new platform for expanded auto trade with the rest of the continent. Now, a number of countries on our continent are already setting up their own auto manufacturing plants, but they are going to be relying on South Africa to supply them with various components and a whole lot of other products that go into building cars. Now, this will be the part of our concerted effort to boost our manufacturing sector, which has been going down. This year, we will begin to harness the opportunities presented by the African Continental Free Trade Area, which came into operation on the 1st of January following the adoption of the Johannesburg Declaration by the African Union. The AFCFTA provides a platform for South African businesses to expand into markets across the continent and for South Africa to position herself as a gateway to the continent, to address the deep inequalities in our society. We must accelerate the implementation of broad-based Black economic empowerment policies on ownership, on control and management of our economy. That is a policy that must be implemented, and there is no reversal on that policy whatsoever. Last year, government agreed to landmark deals with companies that will advance Black economic empowerment by transferring ownership to their workers. In November last year, we held our third South African Investment Conference to review the implementation of previous commitments and to generate new investment into our economy. Even under the difficult economic circumstances, the investment conference managed to raise 108 billion rand in additional investment commitments from a number of investors. Together with investment commitments confirmed from the two previous investment conferences, we've now received 773 billion in investment commitments towards our 5-year target of 1.2 trillion rand. This is phenomenally successful. Firms have reported that some 183 billion of these investments has already flowed into projects that benefit the South African economy. This shows that our country is still an attractive investment destination for both local and offshore companies. We have worked to facilitate investment by increasing the ease of doing business, including by making it easier to start a business. This is one area that had slipped backwards, and we've been doing quite a lot of work to ensure that the ease of doing business is boosted so that investors, business people can easily come to our country, set up companies, and start business. In the past year, more than 125,000 new companies have been registered through the BIS portal platform, completing their registration in just a matter of hours from the comfort of their homes or their offices. And now it happens just like that, in a flash. We are making it easier for business to do business. Our third priority intervention is an employment stimulus to create jobs and to support livelihoods. The largest number of jobs obviously will be created by the private sector in a number of industries as the economy recovers. So the private sector remains the primary and the biggest creator of jobs. And it is for this reason that we've embarked on massive reforms so that the private sector can continue investing in our country. We continue to work in a social compact with the private sector to create more conducive environments for them to be able to create jobs. Our compact with the private sector is underpinned by a clear commitment to grow our economy and to create jobs. However, the public sector also has a responsibility to stimulate job creation, both through its policies and through direct job creation opportunities. The presidential employment stimulus is one of the most significant expansions of public and social employment in South Africa's history. By the end of January 2021, over 430,000 opportunities have already been supported through the stimulus. Now, a further 180,000 opportunities are currently in the recruitment process. These opportunities are in areas like education, the arts, film, and so forth, and culture, global business services, early childhood development, and small-scale and subsistence farming. It also involves environmental programs such as the clearing of alien trees, the wetland rehabilitation, fire protection and prevention, as well as cleaning and greening across our municipalities. These programs are about real lives and real livelihoods. Nearly 500,000 people are now receiving an income, developing new skills, and contributing to their community and to the country's economy. This is no small feat. It means something is being done. We will continue to support employment for as long as it is necessary while the labor market recovers, even as we work to promote stronger and more resilient growth in the private sector. So we see a symbiotic relationship between the public sector and the private sector. The private sector will create the greatest bulk of jobs. But at the same time, at the public sector level, it is essential that, yes, we also focus on what happens in our schools, what happens on the social economy side, and all these matters are being attended to. In the State of the Nation address last year, in response to the huge challenge our country faces with regards to youth unemployment, I announced that the National Youth Development Agency and the Department of Small Business Development would provide grant funding and business support to 1,000 young entrepreneurs within 100 days. While the program had to be put on hold due to the coronavirus, it nevertheless managed to reach its target of 1,000 youth businesses by International Youth Day on the 12th of August 2020. And we applaud the young people of our country who are running this program. This provides a firm foundation for our efforts to support 15,000 startups by 2024. Last year, we said we would establish a national pathway management network to provide support and opportunities to young people across the country. I want to encourage every young South African to join the more than 1.2 million people who are already in the network and take their next steps to a better future. Of the many hardships our people had to experience last year, schooling disruption placed a huge burden on learners, on teachers, and also on families. Despite this, they persevered. It is our priority for this year to regain lost time and improve educational outcomes from the early years through to high school and post-school education and training. The fourth priority that I'd like to talk about of the recovery plan is to rapidly expand energy generation capacity in our country. Now, restoring Eskom to operational and financial health and accelerating its reconstruction process is central to the work that we have to do. Eskom has been restructured into 3 separate entities for generation, transmission, and distribution. This will lay the foundation for an efficient, modern, and competitive energy system in South Africa. Eskom is making substantial progress with its intensive maintenance and operational excellence programs to improve the reliability of its coal fleet. We are working closely with Eskom on proposal to improve its financial position, to manage its debt, and reduce its dependence on the fiscus. This requires a review of the tariff path to ensure that it reflects all the reasonable costs and measures to resolve the problem of municipal debt as well. In December 2020, government and its social partners signed the historic Eskom Social Compact, which outlines the necessary actions we must take collectively and as individual constituencies to meet the country's energy needs now and into the future. Now, over the last year, we have taken action to urgently and substantially increase generation capacity in addition to what Eskom generates. The Department of Mineral Resources and Energy will soon be announcing the successful bids for 2,000 megawatts of emergency power that our country needs. The necessary regulations have been amended and the requirements clarified for municipalities to buy power from independent power producers. Systems are being put in place to support qualifying municipalities. Government will soon be initiating the procurement of an additional 11,800 megawatts of power from renewable energy, natural gas, battery storage, and coal in line with the Integrated Resource Plan of 2019. Despite this work, Eskom estimates that without additional capacity, there will be an electricity supply shortfall of between 4,000 and 6,000 megawatts over the next 5 years as our old coal-fired power stations reach the end of their life. As part of the measures to address this shortfall, we will, in the coming weeks, issue a request for proposals for 2,600 megawatts from wind and solar energy as part of bid window 5. This will be followed by another bid window in August of 2021. Now, recent analysis suggests that easing licensing requirements for new embedded generation projects could unlock up to 5,000 megawatts of additional capacity and also help to ease the impact of load shedding. We will therefore amend Schedule 2 of the Electricity Regulation Act within the next 3 months to increase the licensing threshold for embedded generation. This will include consultation amongst key role players on the level at which the new threshold should be set and the finalization of the necessary enabling frameworks. Eskom has already started work to expedite its commercial and technical processes to allow this additional capacity onto the grid within undue delays. There have been complaints that the time that they take to process these has been far too long. It's now been agreed that they are going to do it much quicker. Now, as we mobilize all the resources at our disposal to support economic recovery, we cannot lose sight of the threat that climate change poses to our environmental health, socio-economic development, and economic growth. We are therefore working to fulfill our commitments under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement, which include the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Eskom, our largest greenhouse gas emitter, has committed in principle to net zero emission by 2050 and to increase its renewable capacity. So Eskom will be looking to partner with investors to repurpose and to repower part of its coal fleet. This will be done in a way that will stimulate investment, that will also stimulate local economic activity, as well as local manufacturing, as part of the just transition that will need to take care of the people who work in those power stations, the people who work in the towns where power stations reside. Our work on climate change will be guided by the Presidential Coordinating Commission on Climate Change, which is meeting for the first time this month. The Commission will work on a plan for a just transition to a low-carbon economy and climate-resilient society. We will not achieve higher rates of growth and employment if we do not implement structural economic reforms. These reforms are necessary to reduce costs and barriers to entry into our economy. They are necessary also to increase competition, to stimulate new investment. They are also necessary to create space for new entrants into the market. This work is being driven through Operation Vulindlela, which involves a team of National Treasury and the President's Office. Operation Vulindlela is focusing on reforms in the electricity, water, telecommunications, and transport sectors, as well as reforms to our visa and immigration regime. The completion of digital migration is vital to our ability to effectively harness the enormous opportunities that are presented by technological change that is just going on around the world. After many delays, we will begin the phased switch off of our analog TV transmitters from next month. It is anticipated that this process, which will be done province by province, will be completed by the end of March in 2022. The process for the licensing of high-speed spectrum is at an advanced stage. We hope that the ongoing litigation amongst interested parties on the licensing matter will provide certainty and will not unduly delay the spectrum auction process that we've decided on. In the water sector, we are working through Operation Vulindlela to ensure that water licenses are finalized within the revised time frame of 90 days and to revive the green drop and blue drop programs to strengthen water quality monitoring in our country. Now, we will finalize and implement the revised raw water pricing strategy and accelerate the establishment of a National Water Resource Infrastructure Agency. I firmly believe that if we really do want to resolve our water challenges, we need an agency that will be focused just on ensuring that water is treated with the importance and the sensitivity that it requires. Many of our people are struggling. They cry out for water on an ongoing basis. Now, establishing a water agency will be one of the better ways to resolve these challenges so that the agency can have a globular look at the water needs of the country and address those challenges. Our ability to compete in global markets depends on the efficiency of our ports and rail network. We are repositioning Durban as the hub port for the Southern Hemisphere and developing Ngqura as the container terminal of choice. The rail corridor from Gauteng is being extended to enable the export of vehicles through Port Elizabeth. These are crucial steps to move freight from road to rail and increase the competitiveness of the rail system in our country. Now, work is underway with the relevant departments to reform our visa immigration regime to attract skills and to grow the tourism sector. As international travel starts to recover in the wake of COVID-19, we will undertake a full rollout of e-visas to visitors from China, India, Nigeria, Kenya, and 10 other countries in the world. Now, the revised lists of critical skills will be published for public comment by the Department of Home Affairs within 1 week to ensure that the final version reflects the skills that are needed by our economy. This, too, has taken far too long to be done, but it is now going to be done. The momentum that Operation Vulindlela has already built and the support that it has received across government shows that we are serious about reform. We will continue to work relentlessly and without pause to create a more modern, a more efficient and competitive economy that is more open to all South Africans. Now, to support our reform process, the Presidential State-Owned Enterprise Council has outlined a clear set of reforms that will enable these vital public companies to fulfill their mandate for growth and development. Overarching legislation for state-owned enterprises will be tabled in Cabinet this financial year and Parliament in the next financial year. A centralized SOE model is being implemented this financial year, which will ensure a standardized governance, financial management, and operational performance framework for all our SOEs. The mandates of all SOEs are being re-evaluated to ensure that they are responsive to the country's needs and the implementation of the National Development Plan. In the midst of the economic damage caused by COVID-19, South Africa's agricultural sector has performed remarkably well. In 2020, we became the world's second largest exporter of citrus, with strong export growth in wine, in maize, in nuts, in deciduous fruit, and in sugarcane. Now, the favorable weather conditions in 2020 and the beginning of the 2021 mean that agriculture is likely to grow in the near term. This provides an opportunity for further public-private partnerships in the agricultural sector to promote transformation and to ensure sustainable growth. It is an opportunity to accelerate land redistribution through a variety of instruments such as land restitution, expropriation of land in order to boost agricultural output. To date, government has redistributed over 5 million hectares of land, totaling around 5,500 farms to more than 300,000 beneficiaries. This is in addition to the land restitution process, which has benefited over 2 million land claimants and resulted in the transfer of 2.7 million hectares of land. We are also pursuing programs to assist smallholder and emerging farmers with market access to develop skills across the entire agricultural value chain and to increase the number of commercial black farmers as well. During the course of the next financial year, we will establish a Land and Agrarian Reform Agency to fast-track land reform. The public service is at the coalface of government, and lack of professionalism does not just impact service delivery, it also dents public confidence. Now, advancing honesty, ethics, and integrity in the public service is critical if we are to build a capable state. Now, through the National School of Government, we continue to roll out courses and training programs to government officials, from entry level to senior management and to the executive. In October last year, I signed off on ministerial performance agreements with all ministers, which have now been published online. This will enhance accountability and focus performance by members of the executive. We remain on course to build a capable and professional civil service that delivers on its mandate and is accountable to the people of South Africa. We are proceeding with our efforts to strengthen local government and to strengthen local government infrastructure and accelerate service delivery through the district development model. The model to focus on key priorities and implementation of critical high-impact projects. Working with both public and private sector partners, government is implementing a range of measures to support municipalities to address inadequate and inconsistent service delivery in areas such as water provision, infrastructure build, maintenance. We are also focusing on the appointment of properly qualified officials at local level to ensure effective management and provision of services. In some municipalities, we have often found that less than well-qualified people have been appointed, and all they ever do is to mess up. Now we are saying the days of messing up are now over. We want professional people to run our local government. As we prepare for local government elections, which are due to take place this year, we will need to adjust to the conditions forced upon us by COVID-19 so that we can ensure that the people of this country can determine who represents them at the crucial level of government. So, fellow South Africans, corruption is one of the greatest impediments to the country's growth and development. The revelations from the Zondo Commission of Inquiry lay bare the extent of state capture and related corruption. Now, testimony of the Commission has shown how the criminal justice system was compromised and weakened. It is therefore vital that we sustain the momentum of rebuilding that we have begun through the past 3 years. There has been great progress in turning around law enforcement bodies. Critical leadership positions have been filled with capable, experienced, and trustworthy professionals. There is improved cooperation and sharing of resources between the respective law enforcement agencies, enabling more integrated approach to investigations and prosecutions. We have started the implementation of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, which lays the basis for a comprehensive and integrated society-wide response to corruption. We will shortly be appointing the members of the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council, which is a multi-sectoral body that will oversee initial implementation of the strategy and the establishment of an independent statutory and anti-corruption body that will report to this Parliament. To this Parliament. Not to the executive, but to this Parliament, to all of you sitting here, it will report. When reports started to surface last year about possible fraud and corruption in the procurement of COVID-related goods and services, we acted with speed and decisively to put a stop to these practices, to investigate all allegations, to act against those responsible. We established the Fusion Center, which brings together key law enforcement agencies to share information and resources. Now, this Fusion Center has brought many cases to trial and preserved or recovered millions of rands in public funds. The Special Investigating Unit was authorized to investigate allegations of unlawful conduct with respect to COVID procurement by all state bodies during the national state of disaster. As it reported last week, the SIU has finalized investigations into 164 contracts with a total value of 3.5 billion rand. In a significant advance to transparency and accountability, the Political Party Funding Act will come into operation on the 1st of April of this year. Yeah? Well, you don't seem to be very excited about this. It's now going to happen. This will regulate public and private funding of political parties. Among other things, it requires the disclosure of donations to parties and establishes two funds that will enable represented political parties to undertake their programs. Crime and violence continues to undermine people's sense of safety and security. Tackling crime is central to the success of our recovery. Crimes like cable theft, railway infrastructure vandalism, land invasion, construction sites disruptions, and attacks on trucks hamper economic activity and discourages investment. We are taking steps and will continue to take steps to stop these crimes and to deal with those responsible in terms of the law. Task teams have been set up in a number of provinces to deal with extortion and violence on sites of economic activity. We are also fast-tracking the implementation and capacitation of the Border Management Agency to curb illegal immigration and cross-border crime. That is now going to happen. Ending gender-based violence is imperative if we lay claim to being a society that is rooted in equality and non-sexism. When I launched the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide in April last year, I made a promise to the women and children of our country that we were going to strengthen the criminal justice system to prevent them being traumatized again and to ensure that perpetrators face justice. Now, to give effect to this, 3 key pieces of legislation were introduced in Parliament last year to make the criminal justice system much more effective in combating gender-based violence. To ensure that perpetrators are brought to book, we are making progress in reducing the backlog of gender-based violence cases. We continue to provide care and support to survivors of gender-based violence. In the State of the Nation address last year, I said that we would prioritize the economic empowerment of women. Last year, Cabinet approved a policy that 40% of public procurement should go to women-owned businesses and entities. And our several departments in government have started implementing this policy and are making a great deal of progress. Last week, we also launched a groundbreaking private sector-led GBVF response fund. Several South African companies and global philanthropies made pledges to the value of 128 million rand to assist in the fight against gender-based violence. Now, that was unprecedented. Over the next 3 years, government will allocate approximately 12 billion rand to implement the various components of the National Strategic Plan. Gender-based violence will only end when everyone takes responsibility for doing so in their homes, in their communities, in their workplaces, and in their places of worship, and in our centers of learning, schools, universities, and colleges. Equally, we need to give attention to issues affecting children, including improving school readiness, ECD planning, and funding protection against preventable diseases, policy reform around child welfare and reducing violence against children. In the year ahead, we are also going to forge ahead with efforts to provide greater opportunities to persons with disabilities to participate in the economy and in society in general. As we rebuild our economy in the midst of this pandemic, it is necessary that we continue within our means to provide support to those businesses and individuals that continue to be most affected. Businesses in several sectors are still struggling, and many families continue to suffer as the job market slowly recovers. Over the last few months, we have had ongoing discussions with our social partners in business, in labor, and community-based organizations on the proposed extension of some of the social and economic support measures. We have therefore decided to extend the period for the special COVID-19 grant of 350 by a further 3 months. This has proven to be an effective and efficient short-term measure to reduce the immediate impact on the livelihoods of poor South Africans who are out of work. We've also decided to extend the COVID-19 TERS benefit until the 15th of March 2021, only for those sectors that have not been able to open or to operate. The conditions for this extension and the sectors to be included will be announced after consultation with the social partners at NEDLAC. The National Treasury will work with its partners and stakeholders on improvements that we believe now need to take place to the loan guarantee scheme that we inaugurated when we announced the 500 billion rand distress relief package. Now, this is better addressed through the discussions that will be had, but we also wanted to address the realities of small, medium enterprises and other businesses as they strive to recover. So that scheme needs to be recrafted, repositioned, and the Minister of Finance will deal with the matter. Now, we will work with our social partners to ensure that these and other interventions provide the relief to those who need it most. Now, fellow South Africans, just as a harsh fire gives new life to our country's fynbos, this crisis is an opportunity to build a different and a better South Africa. Rebuilding our country requires a common effort. It requires that every South African takes responsibility and plays their part. Let us work together as government, as business, as labor, as political parties, and all of society to clear away the rubble and lay a new foundation as we rebuild our country. Above all, let us return this country to the values upon which it was founded. On the day of his release 31 years ago, Madiba gave his first public address here in Cape Town, where he reminded South Africans that there were difficult days that lay ahead and that the battle was far from won. Madiba said, "Now is the time to intensify the struggle on all fronts. To relax our efforts now would be a mistake which generations to come will not be able to forgive." Close quotes. In counting the great cost to our society over the past year, we may be tempted to lose faith. But we can get through this because we are a nation that never gives up. We are a nation that is never defeated. We are a nation of heroes right across the country. I am referring not to the glorious lineage of struggle icons, but to the everyday heroes that walk amongst us, who work hard every day to put food on the table of their homes, to keep the company running, and to give support, help, and care to our people. It is your resilience that will help this country recover. In addition to the many challenges that beset our people, we have heard that His Majesty King Goodwill Zwelithini has not been well in recent days, and he has had to be admitted to hospital. I wish to convey my wishes for speedy recovery of His Majesty King Zwelithini. Our thoughts and prayers are with the royal household and the Zulu nation at this difficult time that the King is going through. It is our collective wish that Isilo Samabandla Wonke is soon restored to good health. As we prepare for the difficult path that lies ahead, we can draw strength from Maya Angelou's great poem, I Rise. And she writes, out of the hearts of history's shame, I rise. Up from a past that's rooted in pain, I rise. I'm a black ocean, leaping and wide, welling and swelling. I bear in the tide, leaving behind nights of terror and fear. I rise into a daybreak that's wondrously clear. I rise, bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise, and I rise. Goes codes. Now, people of South Africa, it is your country that calls on you to rise. Let us march forward together to equality, to growth, to dignity, and to recovery. May God continue to bless and protect our beautiful country, and also to protect her sons and daughters. I thank you.
Long live President Ramaphosa, long live!
Welcome back to the studio in Cape Town. Gentlemen, we'd really hoped that it was going to be a different SONA, but I think we were always destined to be disappointed. It was the usual batch of promises, identification of issues that the DA has been pointing out for years, claims to have master plans to deal with these issues, but of course having a master plan and implementing a master plan, two very different things. No vaccine rollout plan, no answer to the energy crisis, no commitment to actually do something about the corrupt cadres exposed at the Zondo Commission. The only three V's tonight were vagueness, vanity, and visionless. Where to start, Asher?
Oh, well, I think let's start where we started, which was the vaccine. And once again, we're in a circumstance where we're being drip-fed and told that this about the vaccine. Now, we've been told that there will be, 80,000 Johnson & Johnson vaccines coming, that they will be able to get a total of 9 million Johnson & Johnson vaccines. It's not nearly enough to reach population immunity, firstly. But secondly, and this is most important, they still haven't admitted to the fact that when the rest of the world was trying to secure vaccines, they were sitting on their hands, and Treasury only received a request for a deviation to procure vaccines on the 7th of January this year. The health minister says that the reason why they couldn't get vaccines was because of financial constraints. The finance minister says that's not the case, and there's still no clarity on that. So if we, again, go back to where we started, and still nothing on the vaccines, no clear rollout plan, tells us that the provinces all have plans. The only one we've seen is the Western Cape plan. So that remains to be seen as to whether we'll see anything there. He didn't once speak about the lockdowns and its impact on South Africans. He didn't mention over the past year since his last State of the Nation address, there have been a whole lot of irrational regulations that affected business. They had nothing to do with COVID. Telling people they can't buy flip-flops had absolutely nothing to do with whether or not you can contract the coronavirus. And he didn't once mention the sacrifices that South Africans made and to abide by his regulations. He was adamant that they have the scientific-driven approach, which he claims that they're using, is the approach that has that they have implemented. But again, when you match that with reality, if you believed in science that much, if you're going to follow the science, your first order of business would be to make sure that you secure vaccines. Yeah. So, that just there alone gives us an indication that there's no change, no new plan, that it is business as usual, and unfortunately business as usual is not very good.
Just before I come to you, Solly, just to remind everyone watching that we will cross to the federal leader, John Steenhuisen, as soon as we get the opportunity, once he's left the chamber and has gone outside to be able to speak to us. Solly, the only real job creation I heard were a number of commissions, advisory councils and agencies that are going to get set up to run as yet to be implemented promises. I mean, anything at all positive on that front?
Look, it was a very underwhelming speech. And the president tried to dig deep towards the end in closing with, that iconic poem from Maya Angelou. But if you had followed the speech, followed every commitment that was made, the only thing that will rise is the disappointment in the president's lack of courage to provide the solutions that our country needs now. I mean, on job creation, he spoke about how the private sector is the biggest creator of jobs, but yet his own government's policy interventions are opposite of the environment that you need to attract the investment. I mean, he spoke about how Durban will become the, hub port of the Southern Hemisphere. The reality is the Durban port as is now, it has dilapidated infrastructure. It is incapacitated to deal with the volume that needs to go through that port in order for economic activity to take place. I mean, he once again spoke about smart cities, and he seemed to have, a very unhealthy obsession with smart cities. Our current cities are collapsing. Service delivery in ANC-led cities is collapsing. The quality of services provided there is minimal. The basket of free services that they can offer to poor residents is minimal.
Just cut in there. We see John is speaking to the media there. We're just going to cross to Parliament quickly and hear what John's got to say. Okay, we're not having that link coming through for the sound. Sorry, the point you're making very, 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 very strong.
Yeah, and absolutely. The point about having professional people running, the public service. In order to do that, the first way to do that is to abandon cadre deployment, because it is the ticket that the ANC uses to have unqualified people who do not have the skills that continue to hold the public service hostage. And I mean, he spoke about relief for SMMEs. The reality is so many of the SMMEs have gone under that any relief that comes now is going to be even more costly to revive a collapsed business than if the interventions had come a bit earlier. He said nothing about rural safety, which just tells you this government's priorities when it comes to, safety in rural communities, but also in the farming community.
And I think we see John now speaking to the media there on television. I think before he went in, he spoke to us. He said pretty much we need to protect the people, we need to protect the economy, we need to protect democracy. And we didn't see a lot of that.
No, I mean, in fact, the biggest thing that came out this week that the president touched on once was the revelation of the abuse of the resources and the apparatus of the State Security Agency for political aims, to bribe judges, to influence the media, all sorts of things, to try and destroy any opposition to the ANC, to undermine the fabric of a democracy. In any other country, this sort of triggered the resignation of the government. Yeah. And I think it was the Netherlands, the government resigned over a welfare of child, where they were misidentifying people abusing child welfare benefits, and the entire government resigned over that. This is a far bigger scandal. It shows how the state is using security apparatus to undermine independent institutions, to undermine civil society, to completely erode democracy and its functionality. And the president had absolutely nothing to say on that. I mean, that should really outrage so many people. We always go into these speeches, as I said, Sally and I were saying before the president started speaking, saying we hope this year will be different. Yeah. And, right off the bat, he lets us down on the most shocking revelations we've seen this week.
And that is something that I think a lot of people out there, far more probably than 8 or 9 years ago, are following this and saying, wow, this is impacting on your life, it's impacting on my life. And I think the pandemic has made people a lot more aware of how these type of things actually impact on their life. And we didn't get any answers tonight.
Absolutely. I mean, what the pandemic has done to the political landscape is allow people to listen and track more carefully what government says, how government performs, and what the role of government is. So by now, you'll realize that, in characteristic President Ramaphosa's speech delivery, he was, trying to reflect the magnitude of the moment in order to downplay the scrutiny that would come in. But if you check his language around corruption, if you check his language around reforms, it was a repetition of every intervention that he has done when faced with a big responsibility. Another commission, another agency established, another ministerial committee. So it is again this culture of outsourcing key decision-making that the office of the president can make, because it has those powers. If you are trying to be decisive about corruption and acknowledge the key work that the Zondo Commission has done, start in cabinet, start in the presidency, where even your spokesperson was embroiled, in a questionable tender. He ended his speech about a rallying call about working towards the values that this country was founded on. Integrity in the public service is one of the key values. If you remember very well, one of the key things about the ANC's government was the Batupili principles, which is about serving honestly. This government isn't serving in line with the principles of Batupili, and that speaks to the lack of integrity in there, because at the senior level of political leadership, there is no consequence for not having integrity.
And we saw John there being interviewed, and I'm sure he's now moved on to the other broadcasters who will also be looking to chat to him. And in the past, some cynical people have said, that the DA just complains about what the ANC is doing. But I think, especially over the last period of time, this has been shown clearly that we're not complaining. We're pointing out the massive failings, the impact on the people, and what we can bring to the party.
Yeah, well, I think the role of loyal opposition, and that's a very important term, loyal opposition, is that you're loyal to the Constitution, you're loyal to the people. And democracy needs a thin blue line, and I use the color deliberately, but it needs a thin blue line of people who point out where things need to be improved, where things need to work better, and what the policy alternatives are. And, quite frankly, creating another commission is not going to solve the problem. He promised a commission today on, what did he call it, land reform agency. You've got an entire land reform ministry.
Yeah.
You've had endless promises around land reform, and then you doubled down, which he did today, on expropriation without compensation, and said that it would boost agricultural output. Well, does anyone sort of in his entire battery army of policy advisors and in the ministry itself and said to him, there's one simple fact that you can't get away from. Policy uncertainty will add to declining output, not improving output. Expropriation without compensation creates nothing more than another avenue of policy uncertainty. So when you look at this, by and large, it's really the role of loyal opposition to make these points. You can't stand up and say expropriation will boost agricultural output. No. Seizing property has never boosted any economic productivity anywhere in the world. If anything, it shows a government drunk on and abusing power. That's how it's always been abused. And so it's critical to have loyal opposition pointing these things out at every avenue, to be that thin blue line, and hopefully rally enough people to hold the line against some of these crazy ideas.
Something I picked up, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but when we're speaking about Eskom, and the president goes and says in the next however many years, they're not going to have enough capacity. It's going to be between whatever 1,000 and 6,000. There won't be enough. But in the same breath, saying that they're aiming for zero emissions and they're going to move into renewables. You can't take something that's dismally failing and say, okay, let's send you off in another direction until we actually have a stable supply.
That's an important observation, But my frustration with the president's speech is that, he's continuing to exhibit a hope that doesn't exist while remaining, held hostage ideologically by what the ANC stands for, which is the continued takeover of the state. And its failure to realize that it is not the business of the state to run business. The state needs to be considered in creating that environment. But the policy contradictions in government does not create that, certain environment for investment to come to account and for investment also to thrive. So you get the sense that he's trying to exempt himself from the ANC, but he can never truly do that, because we know the limitations that he has in navigating his organization. And who becomes the compromise in that is that the country becomes a compromise as it tries to always pander to balancing the very tense factions in the ANC. And it's just poor form because, this was an opportunity for a president to be able to say, having noted the work that happens at the Zondo Commission and to showcase our loyalty to the Constitution, this is what we're going to do with regards to corruption. And as the presidency is the apex of governments in the country, these are the actions that we are going to take, going forward. I mean, it also comes down to the fact that does the president have a clear understanding of the crisis that the country is in? And I get the sense that he truly doesn't grasp that.
Well, one of the issues is municipalities. He spoke about the municipalities failing and all the desperate need to help these municipalities get back on. It's not all municipalities that are failing. I think we need to understand that there are a number of municipalities, DA municipalities in the Western Cape that don't owe Eskom millions and billions of rands, that haven't collapsed, that don't have a situation where...
Got the DA and opposition parties able to form a new centre in South Africa to create that new horizon for South Africa that we can all move towards.
So the president made no mention of the massive corruption being exposed by Zondo Commission. What's your reaction to that? What is he avoiding?
Well, here's the thing. I mean, he doesn't want to talk about it because the majority of the people that are implicated are his associates in his party. So he talks about a corruption-free civil service. Arthur Fraser is still sitting as the Director General of Correctional Services. He talks about ethics in public life. David Mashlobo, implicated in that Zondo Commission, still sitting as the Deputy Minister in his cabinet. He's got to walk the talk. It can't just be about words and saying nice things. He's got to get to grips. And a really good sign tonight would have been if he had told the nation, I'm giving Mr. Fraser the sack, and I'm also have asked Minister Mashlobo to step down from his duties. That's real accountability, but you're not going to see it because the sands are shifting under his feet in his own party and in the politics generally. New alliances are forming within his party, and if he doesn't act decisively soon, if he doesn't table his reform agenda here in Parliament to firewall it, he's going to fall prey to the enemies of growth that are going to already circle around him, looking for the moment to strike against him.
The president also spoke a lot about agriculture. No mention of improving rural safety, farm murders. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, this is the promises that we've been told, all the time. Promised us gender-based violence, top priority. Gender-based violence incidences have increased over the course of the last year. Promised us more police. Half the target was met. Promised us greater safety in rural areas and a new rural safety plan. It's not met fruition. Rural areas are still under-resourced, under-assisted, under-policed, and our rural communities are daily victims of the most heinous crimes in South Africa. We need to actually get to grips with that far soon. And the president should have, I think, been far more explicit tonight about how he intends to keep his citizens safe.
The president also spoke about business, small, medium enterprises, and how we're going to be supporting them. The reality is so many businesses are in distress. What's your take?
He uses Maya Angelou's I Rise this evening. He asks South Africans to rise while his government, and through their central control and their obsession with the state controlling everything, has got its boots on the neck of small, medium, micro enterprises, entrepreneurs, small business people, keeping them down, preventing them from rising. And when when they're not tied up in regulation and red tape, they're being destroyed by lockdowns and bans that wipe out their customer base, their trading hours, as well as their products. And then they are affected by load shedding. Small spaza shop owners lose their entire day's stock because the lights are out, their freezers go off. Manufacturers have to cut off production time, lay off workers because the electricity runs out. Huge manufacturing processes severely compromised. You cannot ask people to rise and then be doing everything you can as a government to keep people down. They need to let go of state control and give power back to the people in South Africa where it belongs. When they do that, that's when you'll start to see people naturally rising up to be able to flourish into businesses that then create jobs.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you.
Welcome back to the studio. Yes, I think John summed it up pretty well there. We've been speaking about pretty much the same as what he was saying, and very clear there that this is not the way to go. We are not on a path to any sort of recovery here. And interesting, John spoke about I Rise. That's going to go the same way as Tumamina.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at each and every speech, the president SONA address has always found, a very iconic song and a poem, to try and speak out to the mood that he's in and mood that he hopes will drive the country in. But take away the flair and the glamour of the language in there. Stick to the substance. It's going in the opposite direction of what Arise, stands for and represents. Because one, there is no hope that this government has heralded a new era of the policy reforms that it needs in order to attract the investment. There is no hope that this new era has heralded a new way of entrenching accountability in governments, of promoting ethical leadership in government, and of making sure that ultimately there is integrity in the public service.
We're just popping back down to Parliament. I believe we have Siviwe Gaurube, who's standing by. Siv is obviously, as we all know, the Shadow Minister of Health, as well as the National Spokesperson. So it's back to Parliament.
Hi, Siv. Nice for joining us. What is your initial reaction to what the President said today?
Look, I mean, for me, working in the health space, I'm deeply disappointed in the lack of the details that was not provided by the President. I think tonight was a watershed moment where the President needed to really put the meat to the bones of what we've really seen around the vaccine rollout plan. And what we've seen really is a rehashing of details we already had, and also no clear appreciation of the fact that we've just been notified of the low efficacy rate against the 1 million doses of the vaccine that we have in the country. There's 80,000 that he has announced that is coming next week. I mean, that is 80,000, against a 40 million target by the end of the year. And again, the issue around corruption, there was a whole issue where the President is now going to be establishing yet another entity to deal with corruption, where he could have been clear. He could have said, this is what we're going to be doing. We're going to be empowering the criminal justice system. These are the people that must go to jail. I'm condemning the former president for essentially being a constitutional delinquent. He didn't do that. He didn't show the kind of leadership that South Africans are desperately looking for. And this is the thing. This is no moment to be gleeful. This is a really, really disappointing moment, because I think this is when we needed a president that was going to show up for us, because this is a difficult time for many South African families. And of course, ultimately, the extension of the COVID grant, that's welcome. But again, it's a very short-term solution to a very endemic problem. And that's why the fact that he also didn't speak about unemployment and how we're going to get out of that crisis is deeply problematic. And quite frankly, we don't know where to from now, where over 50% of young people are unemployed and 50% of the households in this country are living in grinding poverty.
Thank you, sir. And what's your take on the President not mentioning Zondo Commission at all?
Yeah, the President just kind of made a sweeping statement that, there are some allegations that are coming out of the Commission. But in reality, this Commission has been in existence for 3 years. There's been a number of things which have been discovered through the Commission. There's been names of people who are within his cabinet, of people who are close to him, of people in his government who have been implicated and who've been named in that Commission. And also, he forgets that there was a report which was tabled, which was now testified on at the Commission, that he already had and was in possession of, but still didn't do anything. So again, this is not a moment of saying, I told you so. This is but a moment of reflection of how disappointing this all is, especially during a time like this where South Africans are just desperately needing leadership. And so really what we can do as an opposition party is to hold government to account as much as we can, because ultimately we can't let this go on. We can't let South Africa be in the throes of a third wave without a clear plan around the pandemic. And that's why we are still going to court around the plan around the vaccine rollout. And that's why we're still going to pursue the issue around corruption. It's absolutely critical.
Thank you, Siv. Thanks for your time. And back to
Welcome back to the studio. Yes, the State of the Nation 2021 has come and gone, and as Severo is pointing out, this is not a I told you so moment. This is a moment to reflect on how disappointed we are and how this is not going to take us forward. Asho, a last word from you perhaps on what happened this evening?
Yeah, well, I mean, the president's always big and lofty rhetoric, very weak on plans and deliverables, and really showing us that he is captured by the factions, the various factions of his party, who are closing in on him. But the fight doesn't stop with our little discussion tonight. We will be going to Parliament next week. We will be taking up the debates next week, and I'm sure we will live stream it on our platforms as well. But I have no doubt the DA will pick the fights on corruption, on vaccine rollouts, on energy security, and most importantly, on jobs and unemployment, so that we can secure people's lives and livelihoods once more.
Thank you very much, Solly, from your side.
No, absolutely. I think the common theme for me is just that it's been disappointing. It's a missed opportunity for the president to show courageous leadership at a time that the country needs it the most, and at a time where the country expected its president to come up to the party. He chose to stay in the party, So over the course of next week, from Tuesday to Wednesday, the party will be forming part of the opposition parties that are responding. It will be an opportunity for us to continue to broaden the scope of our ideas in terms of the solutions that we bring and on the themes that Asho have outlined. And we invite everybody who was able to join us today to continue staying on our digital media platforms next week, as we'll be sharing more on our alternatives to the SONA.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who tuned in tonight, everyone watching the show. Of course, my guests, Asho and Solly, thank you so much for your input. And to our DA shadow ministers who contributed via Zoom, giving us some very, very critical information there. As my guests have said, this is not over yet. Keep watching our digital platforms. Don't forget Inside Track on a Wednesday, always a great source of information from everyone involved. Thank you very much and a good night.